Welcome, BBCs, to episode number 157 of the Broken by Concept podcast. This is our second episode we've done with Riot Phroxzon. He's the lead designer at Riot Games on the League Balance Team and also works on preseason changes heavily, focused only on Summoner's Rift. So we're going to be in heavily into the details with that. Okay, so what would you say our first episode was about? Would you say it was more high level sort of stuff, how the balance team works, how they think about balance?
It was more about Riot and how they actually think about changes, right? It was more like, how do they come to decisions? All right, we want to do this. How does the process work? We sit around a board table, we do all this crazy stuff. We didn't know anything about it, right?
How many people were on the team and all that sort of stuff?
We're more thinking about like high level, what's their process. This episode is going to be a lot more focused around the actual details, the actual changes, specifically what's happened this season, and getting Riot's take on a lot of the changes.
Yep, so this is very educational for us, and I think this is really interesting. Would love to get Phroxzon's, philosophy, how Riot are thinking about all these changes. Obviously, the community are very outspoken about balance and stuff like that. So I think it's really good to just get in touch,
get
and see
into the details,
what's going on. Where can we can help as potential high level players as well. So let's get into the details, guys. All right, so first things first, Phroxzon, the recent, I'll call it, is it phenomenon? Statikk Shiv Phroxzon. What is going on? League of Statikk Shiv.
We're coming after you with some pitchforks.
So I guess these are all the questions here around this. Sort of like, what's Riot's? What's your end? What did you guys think of like this change? Did you expect it to have this big of an impact on the game? Was there like a situation at the office? Everyone's like pushing the panic button. We got to go like crazily, we got to nerf this. Like, what was going on, with the whole Statikk Shiv thing?
Well, I mean, I think the whole thing it started with, I guess, Bob Chin was like experimenting with it. That was the first that I heard about it. And then we were like, he was like, this thing is kind of broken, but like, YouTubers will generally make exceptional claims about this type of thing. So it's like, look at a bit of the gameplay.
So he's the LeBlanc guy, right?
And we were he's the LeBlanc guy, yeah. And, like from the design standpoint, the intention of the item is that it would be good for AD champions. But we also recognized that we needed kind of a bridge to AP attack speed champions because, those champions only have Nash's and Rageblade, basically. And we wanted to have another attack speed item that AP champions could use. So this would be, AP Varus, Kayle, Kai'Sa. If Kog'Maw wants to go an AP build, we wanted to kind of leave the grounds open for experimentation because that's kind of where a lot of the interest in the game comes from. Like, someone will just discover a build like Bob Chin did, and it drives a lot of conversation and a lot of excitement and that type of thing. So it's like, our goal is to kind of ride the sweet spot of having somewhat balanced content while also having exciting content. And those are sometimes in conflict, right? Like having exciting stuff often gets abused in ways that might not be originally intended. So we kind of saw that was taking off. And so the first thing we did was look and see, okay, well, is this a LeBlanc issue or is this a Statikk Shiv issue? And is it actually overpowered or is it just, exceptional? Like if there's gameplay that we don't like about it, like what don't we like about it? And initially it didn't seem like on the surface it was overperforming, but that was because a lot of people were not particularly proficient with it.
Yep.
And as people started to learn how to use the wave clear in particular to get a lot of tempo and resets and, like roaming around and stuff, it started to get a little more degenerate. And then also the LeBlanc cases in particular, where she would charge it up very quickly, especially on the snapback, because that just counts as moving like, 60 charge worth of distance. Let's say she snaps back to her W, or if she's like casting W forwards, it's like 20 to 30 charge, right? So she was charging it a lot pretty quickly. And so we're kind of like, okay, well, it seems generally limited to LeBlanc and Kai'Sa, I believe, at the time, being the overperforming champions with it. And everyone else was like kind of within bounds, like Teemo, Corki, like we wanted these champions to be able to use it.
I think you saw Quinn top a bit more. Quinn top
and then
was
Zoe started building it.
Oh, really, Zoe?
Zoe started building it. Yeah, it didn't seem. I mean, it's clearly for champions that are like need to subvert their wave clear weaknesses, like Zoe being an obvious one, LeBlanc being a pretty obvious one as well. So we're kind of looking at that, and it's like if AP Cannon wants to build this item or whatever, like that's cool. Like it's probably not going to be better than Rocket Belt, for example, but like we wanted champions to be able to do that. So that's kind of how our investigation panned out, and we kind of decided that only really LeBlanc and Kai'Sa, and I guess you could kind of say Zoe were performant with it, and everyone else was like within bounds of what would be considered their normal best items. So.
What's interesting is that the item fundamentally attacked a very, very tricky to balance aspect of the game, which is wave clear, right? Like wave clear is such a sticky thing because it's not immediately raw power. It's kind of like, because when you think of wave clear, you're not really doing damage to someone. You're not really exerting anything onto someone else. It's more, how does that wave clear, because champions who lack wave clear typically have other areas inside their kit that make up for the lack of wave clear. That's why, it's a balancing mechanism, I'm assuming, a champion that has a lack of wave clear inside the kit. So when you kind of add in this item that fundamentally adds or solves the entire wave clear problem, like that of LeBlanc, it immediately kind of ramps up all of the other strengths of the champion, because now LeBlanc doesn't have to use her W on the wave anymore. She can then auto attack the wave, explode the wave, and then use her abilities on the enemy now. So it kind of had like a compounding effect on a lot of these kits. From the outside, it seemed like Riot didn't immediately understand how, to what degree. Because I see where you guys were coming from 100%. Like it's like a creative item. It does solve some problems like that of a Gale Force. But when we're having this conversation, whether it's Prowlers, whether it's Gale Force, whether it's Statikk Shiv, when you're actively solving a very key problem or a weakness of a champion, it gets very sticky.
Champions kit, yeah.
Yeah, because you're giving, like, for example, Gale Force. I think about the introduction of Gale Force in League of Legends. Like, I remember distinctly when Gale Force got introduced, the first thing that really came to my mind when I was playing Orianna at the time, I'm like, wow, my champion is so much weaker just off one item. Not because the item does more damage or anything, but I can't land. My threat of the ball with Shockwave now is completely nullified. That completely changed Orianna's effectiveness into so many champions. So there's this very sticky kind of compound or like extra effects. Do you have any kind of comments on that?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a matter of degrees, right? And it's a topic that we discuss a lot internally, which is like how much we kind of call it like game warping power or pattern warping power should an item have, right? And this was a big discussion during Mythic items, for example, because previously the limit I would say was probably something like Hextech GLP or Hextech Gunblade, like previous to the item rework. I would say those are probably like the most pattern warping items. Like you would say, for example, Ahri's kit is designed around being able to hit your charm and using your Spirit Rush to be able to line up your charm, right? And then, when we release GLP, suddenly the person can't move. So then, like they're just getting hit by the charm, right? But it's like, it's up to players basically to determine whether that's okay. And the extent to which that's okay. So for example, like Prowler's Rek'Sai was a thing for a long time. And I know Nathan played a lot of Rek'Sai, but it's Prowler's Rek'Sai, is that too far? Or like Prowler's Pike, for example, right? Like, is that too far of a, solve for the champion's kit? And it's like, it's unclear, right? Like there's no formula for this is too far or this is not too far. Like you could say, hey, Fiddlesticks or Morgana with Zhonya's, right? Like that's too far, right? Like they shouldn't be allowed to go invulnerable in combat. But like the community has accepted that. It's become a cool thing for those champions to engage in. And ultimately, the kit gets balanced around it. So I mean, you're correct in that. Let's say, for example, like LeBlanc's single target damage is significantly higher, and so if she gets to solve her wave clear, then she's probably going to get overtuned, right? And similar to Zoe, right? Like Zoe's single target damage is incredibly high, and her weakness is she doesn't have a lot of wave clear, she doesn't have a lot of like fallback mechanisms, so she gets behind, she's like super screwed, right? So it does solve those aspects of a champion's kit, but with the items, we're just generally thinking, okay, well, how much is too far? And we have this set of like fundamental gameplay principles like counterplay, moment to moment action, like satisfying button presses, choice, like satisfaction, all of these core fundamental gameplay principles that we're trying to evaluate every time we, release one of these types of items or new choices into the game.
Yeah.
We just need to kind of make a judgment call of, okay, well, is this too far? And I think in Shiv's case, we were like, yeah, once you get a bit of AP and you can one-shot the casters with one auto, so you like don't need to be near the wave really, like that's a bit too far, right? And we thought that maybe having to purchase AD and the crit, like you're wasting basically, 1,600 gold worth of stats basically. It's like, that's a pretty significant trade-off to take, but it's like, yeah, it didn't end up being enough for LeBlanc in particular. But I think for most other champions, it's probably pretty reasonable. Like we want that kind of hybrid AD AP style item in the game.
So Broxon, you said the stats weren't really showing that much. So in terms of your process, like knowing that like something that's the community, like are you looking at Twitter or like Reddit? Like is that the first thing that you saw and then it was the stat? Because you said that stats weren't, how does that work?
So normally, last time I talked about, we had this kind of state of the game meeting on Mondays, where we basically reviewed the state of the game and everybody brings their findings and then we kind of discuss it as a group. And then ultimately, like I'll make the final decisions on most things. So I'll also do like a bit of investigation of my own. But each person, we have one person per role that brings findings for their roles. And it's like, it's something we talked about. And we were like, okay, in this particular case, it's like, okay, the first thing that the person does is they would look up, okay, who is predominantly buying this item, right? Like we have a lot of internal dashboards that, we can look at and be like, okay, in order, this is the number of people who are purchasing it at different skill brackets. And it's like, oh, actually like in Elite, which is, Masters Plus, a lot of LeBlanc players are buying Shiv a lot more than Ludens. Like if you were to look at like gold or something, like, the pick rate was like 1/3 of what the elite players were doing. So we're like, okay, well, this is probably going to catch on. And then we look at, the actual performance of the item relative to other items. So it's like when elite players are buying Ludens versus when elite players are buying Statikk Shiv, like how much performance difference is there, right? And, we have a lot of other different item dashboards where it's like, look at how they perform when they're ahead and look at how they perform when they're behind at certain time frames and this type of thing. So we do that investigation and then we're like, oh, okay, well, it doesn't seem super out of line. It's probably, we had a suspicion that it was going to be her best item on that patch. But that's okay. Champions have best items on patches, like when we release them. Like that's not a bad thing. I think at the time, even elite players had not fully optimized it. And so, we kind of made I can't remember whether we patched it immediately the next patch or we let it sit for.
I can't remember.
I remember it took a while for it to get. That was the only criticism I had. It felt like it was around for too long, at least the hotfix anyway, or the patch. Sorry, because I think it didn't it? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it got like a miniature hotfix and then it got actually changed, or did it never get hotfixed?
I have a feeling we didn't hotfix it. So, the other thing that was kind of a conflating factor was that the actual item for AD champions was underpowered. So on release, Shiv was quite bad, and it continued to be quite bad. And we kept trying to buff it in its unique aspects, which was its wave clear, right? And then that's eventually what like the straw that broke the camel's back. So I think, like in that sense, it was under adopted and. Yeah, I'm just taking a look.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually had a question. We'll get to it actually, I think it makes sense now because while we're on this topic, so someone in my Discord actually had this question. He was saying how, one thing he hears repeated a lot in the League community is that there are champions who are played more by quote unquote like mains than casuals, like an Akshan or a Quinn or a Riven. And these champions can have an inflated win rate as a result. Is there any truth to this, or is this just kind of like community, hodgepodge essentially? And does the balance team, in fact, take that into account, that the champion has a broad or niche player base when they're making balance changes?
Yeah, one of my pet projects over the last year or a year and a half has been to very extensively research this topic. So, I wanted to find out basically, let's say, for example, you were playing Orianna and a silver person in your mid lane academy was playing Orianna. I wanted to understand what the difference is between you and the silver player playing Orianna would be. And I wanted to understand what the difference is between a pro player and that same silver player playing the Orianna. Because like we know that elite play and pro play are pretty different, right? The other thing that was lumped into this was trying to figure out how much impact someone playing their main champion or maining a champion has on the win rate. Because, like when I look at, let's say, Yasuo's win rate on an external site, it is generally true that people playing Yasuo, there's a higher percentage of people playing Yasuo at a higher mastery level than lower mastery level, right? Like you would consider those players to be mains. However, those people are a small percentage. Like, let's say, for example, I'm just giving a rough approximation here, but I believe it's something like 15 or 20% of people are playing a champion above like 100k mastery or something like that. And so even if those players were performing really, really well, they wouldn't have as much impact on the win rate as you would expect, right? And in fact, the vast majority of people who are playing champions in ranked, probably in your experience in coaching, are in the 0 to 10k mastery range. So, like 30 to 40% of people playing a champion will be in the, 0 to 15 games range of playing a champion. And that probably matches your coaching experience as well. So the outsized level of performance increase for the win rate that you get from being above 100k mastery or something like that, what you would consider a main, right, is pretty much offset by the people like first timing that difficult champion and failing, right?
Right.
And for the most part, there is no, like I did this research like pretty thoroughly. The only champion who had a positive effect on win rate was Katarina, and
Is
the
that
effect
you mean
was
with
only
mastery?
0.4%. Sorry?
You're saying with mastery?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is so what you would consider a main is like, oh, I've played the champion a lot, right? Which I generally use as a proxy for mastery, because you just get mastery from playing, right? Obviously, you're going to get a little more if you win, but generally speaking, the only champion that actually has a positive effect on win rate for mastery is Katarina, and Evelynn is close. It's like 0.1%, and Katarina is something like 0.4%. So the amount that basically her mains, or let's say people from like 25k plus mastery or something, they're offsetting the people that are like failing on their like first 0 to 15
so that's
games.
making the stats. Yeah,
That's warping the stats.
Net by like 0.4%. So that's like the maximum amount that a mains would increase. And most of them are negative, because the 0 to 15 games, firstly, there's just a way higher quantity of them, of those players. And the amount of loss that you have compared to the actual champion's win rate is a lot more significant for a difficult champion. So
yeah,
the
all
coin
the
swings
people that
both
are
ways.
first they play against a Katarina or an Evelynn. They said this champion's broken, and then they play it the next game. And it's their first time. This is where everyone says, "Don't first
Yeah,
time
exactly.
chance." Right? That's
Exactly.
the people. So this champion's broken. I got to play
Well,
this.
it's very interesting though. So with that piece of information, that stat you have specifically about Katarina, has that influenced the way that you think about balancing or altering Katarina?
It has, yeah, because previously, like, we wanted to learn more about how players in aggregate, like, perform on these types of characteristics. And it's an ongoing piece of research, right? Like, I do this in my spare time, so it's like, it's not really like one of our data analysts doing it, but I think my process is pretty thorough in that respect. But I'll track things like the KDA of a champion, their kills, their DPM, their GPM, the number of times they cost Q or W, and the amount of damage that they've taken, and the minions that they've killed, the damage that they've dealt, and stuff like that. And then I can see the difference between let's say, a pro Zeri player, a elite Zeri player, a high mastery Zeri player, and just a normal Zeri player. And then I'll be like, oh, actually, Zeri players in pro play cost 27% more Qs by equivalent game time, or Zeri players in elite cost 17% more Qs, or something like that. And then that might give us some information on how we might want to adjust the champion in the future, and things like that.
Interesting.
Going back to, I'm really curious about this dashboard that you talk about, Phroxzon. So like you said that, so everyone in the team like has like a role that you focus on, right? So like, so let's say so there's one person have a role and they have a dashboard of all the champions in that role, and then someone sees LeBlanc, and then suddenly there's Statikk Shiv being built on this in Master Plus, and then does the system like flag it or something? Like, because there's too many champions in different.
No, so this is an entirely different skill. It's like, are you familiar with like Lolytics or any of the Teamfight Tactics like stats sites?
No, I'm not. I don't know. I really don't go into stats much. No.
Okay,
Is that how it works on
basically,
those sites?
like there are a lot of like external stat sites that like Teamfight Tactics is a good example, but it's basically it can show you the you would have to know how to navigate the data yourself. That's part of the skill of it. Like in many ways, like some of the designers that work on balance, like I think Freak in particular, Freak and myself, and then there's another two people like Madness Hero and so on. They are very good with data, and basically we have, I don't know, I want to say something like 50 different dashboards that tell us different things, and so it's a matter of knowing which dashboards to look at to understand what things you're looking for, right? So we have like a general one, which is like, okay, how is each champion performing at each different skill brackets, right? Like we have the 4 different skill brackets. We have Iron to Plat, Plat to Master, Master Plus, and Pro, right? So we have a dashboard that looks at the win rate, pick rate, ban rate of all the champions in the different skill brackets. And we look at that one and we're like, oh, okay, well, this champion is like OP for silver players or whatever. And then so someone might do a further investigation on that and see, okay, well, what items are they building? When they build these items from ahead, how performant are they? When they build these items from behind, how performant are they? You know, like, and this type of thing. There's basically like an endless list of things that you could investigate. Like if you wanted to kind of get lost in the data, you could. So it's a matter of like being efficient with what you're looking at and knowing what to look for.
Yeah, that makes sense because there's so much there. I guess that comes with the skill of the job and the experience. Yeah, it's not just
because everyone can access data. That's the job of a data analyst. All these people you can to manipulate data. While we're on the topic of items, so you know one of the goals, correct me if I'm wrong, for AD carry this season was to try and make it such that their build paths were more diverse. Did you guys at Riot feel like you did a good job of this? And has that actually worked out?
I wouldn't say making the build paths more diverse was the main goal. The main goal was to increase satisfaction of people buying the items. Like previously we had, we had Shieldbearer, Kraken, and Gale Force as the previous Mythics, right? And ultimately, well, firstly, we wanted to resolve one of the game health problems with Shieldbearer rushing. Like we didn't think that Shieldbearer was a very sustainable design. To the point of the conversation that we were having earlier, it probably pushed to the bounds of counterplay for some of the champions like a bit far. It is both simultaneously the best anti-burst item while having sustain, made it quite difficult to present the champion with a weakness after they've snowballed. So for example, a Yasuo or a Yone or a Samira or a Draven or whatever, if they go shield bow and they snowball, there's not really any answer, because the answer to sustain is burst, right? But then shield bow also solves your burst weakness. So there's nothing systemically that you can actually do against that. So we felt like the item itself had a flawed design when it's rushed. So in the later game, it's fine to have, a shield bow or a Zhonya's or a bloodthirster, this type of item. But in the early game, it's like if this champion gets out of control, it's like there's really not much you can do about it systemically, and we didn't think that that was a good way for these champions to be balanced. And so, there are a few little kind of things that we wanted to resolve with that. And we also wanted to test out a different version of the Mythic structure, because we kind of decided after 2 years of having these mythics in the game, that it wasn't the optimal construction, I would say. Like, we wanted the mythic items to present more of a this is how you want to play your character kind of thing. Whereas shield bow is not really a way you play your character, right? It's just like, okay, you don't play your character around having a shield. You play your character around having big crit attacks. So you play your character around spell casting, or you play your character around having a dash with Gale Force. Or you play a character around playing prolonged fights with Rageblade. That was the type of mythic design that we wanted to try out. And we wanted to see if players found that more satisfying. So that was the main thing. And then we wanted to resolve a few game health concerns and get rid of a few underperforming items and add a few items back as well.
That brings me on to the Mythic system. I want to ask you about the Mythic
Wait,
system.
but before we get on to that, when you were making, the adjustments to a lot of the AD carry items, were like melee users like Yone, Yasuo, even like Belveth, etc., taken into account?
Yeah. We definitely took them into account. I mean, it made it a lot more challenging because, there are some fringe users that also buy crit, like let's say, for example, Viego or Master Yi, like that previously bought Kraken Slayer and things like that. So we need to take those into account. Obviously, Tryndamere we would need to take into account as well. And we also needed to assess whether players would find, especially Yone, Yasuo, and Tryndamere, more frustrating, or not Tryndamere because he was already building Gale Force, but Yone, Yasuo, whether players would find those champions more frustrating when they were building Gale Force rather than building Shield Bow, right? Like, it's one thing to not be able to kill a Yasuo or Yone as like a Victor or something, but it's another thing for Yasuo and Yone to also have Gale Force and then, be killing you. So it's like, like, would players find that more frustrating overall? Like, we weren't sure. So it's kind of just like a bet that we decided to take with that.
Yeah, because
I think it's
interesting
been fine
though
overall.
Because like I feel like Yone itemization after the changes become a lot more linear in a way. Like I feel like before the changes there were many more options for Yone players specifically. Like there was Shield Bow, you could go Gale Force, you could go Bork Rush. There was like a lot of options, but now since the changes, it almost feels like you're kind of tunnel visioned into it. You have like a lot less, I guess, diversity with build paths. Is that something that Riot is aware of right now with specifically Yone, or I want to talk about Yone?
I would
Yasuo.
say I can't remember if it was Yasuo or Yone, but I did see there was some like Stormrazor purchases on those champs as well, for a time, and Kraken for some time. So I mean, I think also it's part of, we'll eventually get to the champions and adjust them in the cases that they don't have, compelling choices. But ideally, those items are also meant to be relatively compelling for them. And I do believe that last I checked, they were purchasing those items at least some of the time and being relatively performant with them. So, I mean, overall, I think the changes put the items in a better spot overall. And we did want to introduce Statikk Shiv back into the game. And part of the reason why we wanted to do the changes was because at the time, ADCs were also having a bunch of satisfaction issues, and we wanted to test this version of Mythic items for potential preseason work. So it was the closest item system to the type of Mythic item system that we wanted to test, basically. So a combination of those two kind of led us down that route.
So my question about the Mythic system that I was going to mention about, what's Riot's view or stance? Do they like the obviously me as a jungler this year, and especially we saw in competitive and stuff, it's always the cost-effective item into the Mythic. We had the Chem Punk into Radiant Virtue, Black Cleaver and Radiant Virtue. You had every AP jungler go Demonic Embrace into Jack Show, or the Malkunt and the Legendaries. Do you think that's intimidating for new players and the way builds change? Because I mean, these items just got brutally murdered very quickly, right? Like the Chem Punk and the Cleaver and stuff, and then it started switching to now you build the Mythic first. And so, what's the view, sort of the way that the builds evolve throughout patches and all that sort of stuff with this system?
So we kind of started with the original design philosophy for Mythics was that we wanted players to make a choice between different Mythic items for classes. Unfortunately, that just didn't work out very well because basically players had to choose between. So some champions had really satisfying Mythic item choice. Like, let's say, for example, Victor at one point could pick between Ludens, Legendaries, Crown, Everfrost. Everfrost's pretty niche, but out of those three, he could pick pretty reliably between those three, and that
you'll
was
build
great,
that first as Victor, right?
But
You'll build
for
one
some
of those items first,
champions,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, I mean, but for some champions, they had to choose between three kind of crappy options, and it's like, like and so even though like maybe I want to say like maybe 40 or 50% of the roster was happy with the mythic item choices that they could choose, that left the other 50% of the roster either having one item that they always bought. So like Samira always buying shield bow, and she's like relatively happy with buying shield bow every game, but it's like it didn't really succeed on adding choice to those champions like we had intended. And for the, I don't know, I want to say like 30 to 40% of champions, like they were really unhappy. Like, like Singed didn't really have a mythic item. Like there's a lot of champions that fall in this category. And so we're kind of like, this is probably not super optimal. So what we tried to do with the tank items, this was the first time we kind of tested out this principle, was we wanted to delay the mythic item purchase to be second. So previously, mythic items were very cost efficient, right? Because we wanted them to be purchased first. And we decided later that we would tune them in a way that would make them able to be purchased either first or second, but mainly second. So you would purchase it first if you had a really good synergy with your champion, and otherwise you would purchase it second. And the whole point of that was now Singed doesn't feel bad because he can buy Rylays first and be happy with that, right? Or he could buy, I don't know, like Chem Tank or something, or he could buy, I don't know, some other random item that demonic if he really wanted to, right? And he didn't feel locked into having to build Riftmaker first, or like God forbid, like Legendaries or something, right? Like, like he wouldn't feel like he has to do that because the item is so overtuned. So that was the principle. That was the type of mythic item that we were trying to test. And the thing that we liked about mythic items was that it's this kind of almost like mythic level of fantasy of thing that you have in your inventory that you plan your build around. That was the original like design vision for it, but then I think we just realized that we needed like 30 more mythic items or something.
Yeah,
like,
it's just not possible.
It's not
all
possible.
The
It's
champions with
impossible.
Strengths,
You can't solve for every champion in the game with a mythic. It's just not going to work.
So you guys are happy with just being it, that it's just like some
I wouldn't
chance?
I wouldn't say we're happy with it for that reason, because if you consider that, let's say for example we had 150 items before, and let's say that in a mythic world we have 150 items. That's not actually the same amount of items that you're choosing from, because the mythic items are exclusive. So if you buy a mythic item, it suddenly removes all the other mythic items from the pool. So now you're only picking between 120 items. And so the needs of the remaining roster of champions needs to be met with that 120 items. Whereas before, you would be able to make that work with 150 items. So actually, to do mythic items, we needed to have more items. So we needed to have something like 180 or like 200 items to make that system work. Then I think it could have worked. But as we did it, because we would need to make a mythic for Singed and Silas and, all of Rumble and all of these people, right? Instead of like Rumble having to build like Rocket Belt, which is like meant to be an assassin item, right? So if we did that, then I think it could have worked. But, that has other costs, right? Like last time we talked about complexity of getting people into the game, and it's like, okay, well now you've increased the number of items by 30%, right? Like, is that acceptable? Is that an acceptable trade-off to have this like mythic level of item in your inventory? Like, probably not, right? So we kind of, at the time, it wasn't super obvious, but we didn't realize that we needed to make more items. We thought we could get away with like, making maybe 10 more items, which is what we did, but we probably needed to have something more along the lines of like 40 or 50 more items to make it work. Then I think it could have worked, but yeah, I think that's just not something we're super interested in moving forward. Don't add another 40, 50 items to the game.
I mean, the game's already as complex as it is now.
Exactly.
That would be overwhelming.
Right. And so like moving forward, it's like we're kind of thinking, okay, well, we're not super happy with mythics and we want to find a way to like move away from them, probably.
Wait, so you mean in terms of the structure or the idea of a mythic item, such that there is no mythic item, or do you mean, like, what do you mean exactly?
So like, let's say for example, like mythic items started with the design goal of let's make something really interesting and cool in the item system, right? There are many ways to do something interesting and cool in the item system, and mythic items is just one of them, right? And so there are, if we decided to continue pursuing something cool and interesting in the item system, then we could keep doing that, and just do something that's not mythic items, and it would achieve the same design goal, but it just wouldn't be mythic items, right?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't
so that's
even.
still an option that's on the table, or we could just revert back to not having mythic items. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a mythic item is cool, but for me personally, I don't really feel like, oh wow, I got a mythic item now. I'm like my champ's extra special. It's like whether I have a Rylai's or whether I have an Everfrost. You know, for me, it's not like a huge difference. You know, like in terms of like mentally the way I perceive the items. You know, like it's like a complete game changer.
I think the thing we were trying to chase was like, I don't know if you guys have played much like Diablo or WoW or any of that. I mean, I know Nathan's played a lot of WoW.
I played a bit of Diablo,
but like, they have, like, let's say you dropped a certain legendary, right? And the legendary, you would play around its unique passive. It's like, oh, this legendary dropped this thing, and it has this specific line that's really build defining and really awesome. That was the type of thing that we were trying to go after. It just doesn't work as well in League as it does in, say, a MMO, or especially PvE, because PvE you can just do whatever nonsense you want.
Yeah, PvE is so different.
No, but also League is
not going to break the game, right?
League's just so complicated because you got to remember, like when you're playing in League, it's like 5 versus 5 people, and the amount of like interactions that they have is like it's unbelievable. The amount of like item interactions you could possibly have. Whereas, you know what I mean? Like when you're doing PvE, it doesn't really matter.
Like a boss that has 1 billion health anyway. It doesn't matter if it gets hit by a little bit more damage or something like that. You know?
Yeah. So like for example, like things that we originally were exploring when we were first exploring mythic items was, okay, mythic items should be giving things that you can't get anywhere else. So let's say, for example, this thing increases your stun duration by 15% or something, right? You know, this type of thing that's like, it's so kit warping and like it's really cool, right? Like,
yeah, that's cool.
And I think we could have designed a system like that. It's just incredibly difficult. Like,
it's so complex. You'd have to have
like,
so many
skill wise. Yeah, it's not only do you have to make a lot, like your system design ability needs to be so strong to make sure that it's like, okay, well, LeBlanc doesn't break the game with this, or like Morgana doesn't break the game with the extended CC duration, right? Like she can perma root someone, or like Brand might be able to CC lock with this thing because you just EQ and get a lot of haste or whatever. So it's like, that's a very challenging thing to design things that are really exciting that won't break the game.
No, I've already had some ideas
where every character is able to limit break, basically.
Yeah, I had some ideas. Like, I was just thinking that you could have like a mythic item for people that have really long range ultimates or global ultimates. Like if they build this mythic, it increases the effectiveness of global ultimates or gives you refunds X amount of the cost of your global ultimate. But then like only like a few very niche champions in the game would ever build that item. But that's so cool because it can completely, that would like give you such a unique experience in the game that would like change the entire kit, you know? I like.
I mean, that's like what I was trying to do with Horizon Focus as well, right? Because it was like, oh, this is something that, if you're a sniping character or a long range character, like you should be able to use this item, and it should feel like, oh, this almost feels like a mythic level thing. It's like I can't get this anywhere else. Like, but then ultimately it was like, okay, well, only 3 champions bought it, right? Like so, you have all these types of like constraints that are like very difficult to design around, and that item's like, it's just a math problem with what does more damage, that or Shadow Flame. So like, over time we've been trying to like force those two apart, but it's kind of difficult because like AP champions only really want damage, and we kind of decided that things like extending CC duration were like off the table because it, just instantly breaks the game with like Morgana or like Brand and stuff like that. Like, yeah.
Well, I don't mind Horizon Focus though, because I actually kind of like it because it actually gives a lot. I like what you've done with the slow aspect of it, because with Ari, it's a really common build path where you go Everfrost into Horizon Focus, and the build path on Horizon Focus is so much better than Shadow Flame because you don't have to go through needlessly large rod. You can just build the Fiendish Codex with the alternator, which is a trillion times better than having to build a needlessly large rod. So I actually do. I'm a big fan of Horizon Focus as an item. It's just, it's very niche, right? Like it has users that want to get it and users that don't want to get it. While we're on, talking about items, one thing I will say, compliment you guys that you did a really great job with was with Oblivion Orb. And the Grievous Wounds. Like, I love that now you can just actively sit on the Oblivion Orb without having to upgrade it to get the baseline Grievous wounds, but then also there's a very clear reason as to why you would upgrade to Morello's. Not just because of the Grievous wounds, because it felt so shit before, where you want to build Grievous wounds and it's like, oh, like you get the orb, but then it's not enough, and then you want to upgrade to the thing, but then you don't get anything else from the Morellos. But now that it gives the magic pen, and then it doesn't change the Grievous wounds, I think was a really, really good change, and it just feels like a trillion times better. So that's one massive.
Like there were two specific problems that we wanted to solve with that. Well, firstly, the reason why it was segmented like that was because we wanted to keep the items relatively simple, but we wanted you to upgrading. We wanted when you upgraded Morello's for it to feel like you were getting something rather than just stats. So then the logical answer to that was, okay, we'll just make the Grievous wounds on the small component less. But then that like just broke some systemic qualities of the game, because now you want to buy this thing against Aatrox, so you want to buy this thing against whoever, right? Soraka, but it's just not powerful enough. And then so it's like, okay, well, now you have to invest 3K into this like kind of crappy item, right? Like that you wish you could have bought Zonya's or something else, right? So, we kind of learnt our lesson in that a systemic outlet component, like we call these systemic outlets, the whole reason why they exist is so that when players stack like 5 of one thing, so like 5 shielders, like I don't know if you remember, there was a time in like season 7 or season 8 where they had like like basically 5 shielders on the team, like and it was just absolute nightmare to play against. These systemic outlets are to like counter those types of things, because if you buy one Grievous Wounds item, it should be able to shut down. You get massive amounts of value because you shut down like 5 people at once. So that's why they exist in the game, because people will often be like, oh, why don't you just get rid of the Grievous Wounds item and nerf healing? Like, well, it wouldn't work because people would just pick 5 Giga healers like Mundo, Soraka, whatever, and there's no answer. Like, you can't actually do anything about it. So that's why they're in the game, and we realized that actually the small component needs to carry that weight and be strong enough to like counter the person. And the second thing was we wanted players to feel good about having this item in the inventory at the end of the game. So that's kind of why we added the magic pen to the Morellos. But we didn't want it in a situation where it's like, hey, actually it's just optimal to buy Morello because of the magic pen. And that was one of the situations that we were in the LS, like Legendaries versus Morello's kind of argument. I don't know if you guys remember when that was going on, but it's like the magic pen is more valuable or whatever, this type of thing.
So. Hot debate. Yeah. So Broxzon, I want you to quickly help me understand, I guess, the community perception and also just reality and experience with Rek'sai. Obviously, I'm a Rek'sai enthusiast myself. So everyone said the Prowler's changed. Champion, gone. Yep. Like everyone in my Salty were packing it up. We're like, all right, we're packing it up. This is gone. We're going to have to find new mains and stuff. And then reality hit. I mean, currently I have like a 60% win rate with Rek'sai. I think I won like 13 of my last 14 games, something like that. Like, I love the Yones, right? Like, and I was just thinking like, okay, like why... So again, like, do we just don't know what we want? I mean, is it just because of the buffs with Rek'sai? I don't even really know what you guys did with Rek'sai. Like, what's going on there? Like, why?
I mean, when the patch changed, right? Like, Prowlers got removed. Well, not removed. It got reworked. Renekton went down. Rek'sai went down. Pyke went down only a little bit because actually Yomu's was like pretty damn strong on release patch.
Incredibly strong.
Yeah, the Hecarim and stuff like that was out.
Yeah. So like. Rek'sai was actually like pretty performant with Yomu's, but even then she was like still quite weak, and so we knew that this was going to happen, so we already had planned work for Rek'sai and Renekton that we were testing internally, like for a patch or two before that, and we decided that Rek'sai players kind of like the assassin playstyle, but it was never really the intent of the champion.
I remember initially it was a tank champion. Like, it was, you build tank, like many season 6-5, remember the tunnels and stuff like that. You build the tank jungle items and stuff. Yeah, like her original design intent was to be kind of using her healing and her tunnels to go in and out of fights, and after season 7 when we reworked her ultimate, like to kind of be playing in the fight and then land a Q and then go in or something, or like, if she found an isolated target, then she'd be able to kill them. But she was always intended to play more of this like fightery playstyle.
We didn't like the tank playstyle, like the Cinder Hulk Rek'Sai or whatever. That was kind of nonsense. But the fighter playstyle we endorsed, and so we were thinking, okay, well, what's a way that we can kind of get this fighter playstyle back? And if you wanted to build full AD, then you can. That was kind of the intent of the changes. So in order to do that, we had to do stuff like, okay, well, her healing is more impactful. So I think Rek'Sai players have generally enjoyed that change overall. And then we also wanted to change her Q cooldown so that because the higher the Q cooldown is, the more damage it has to do. So the lower the Q cooldown is, then the less damage it does. So by lowering the cooldown, it means that the damage can be lower, if that makes sense. So like, okay, let me explain it this way. Let's say Blitzcrank Q cost 200 mana, right? And for that ability to be balanced, it basically has to kill you when it hits, right?
Yep.
So and let's say Blitzcrank Q was 5 seconds cooldown instead of 20 seconds cooldown, right? If Blitzcrank has a 5-second Q cooldown, the damage can't be that high because he's just throwing out a lot of Qs. Yep. So he's going to hit you multiple times with it. It can't kill you instantly if he lands it. So by that logic, if Rek'Sai's Q cooldown is high, it means necessarily that the damage on the spell needs to be high. So by lowering the cooldown on the spell, then we get to lower the damage of the spell. So she plays more of a fighter style play style because she can use her first Q rotation, maybe take a tunnel out or like tunnel in, do a rotation like ult, and then like use her Q again. And that was the type of playstyle that we thought Rek'Sai players might enjoy. So that was kind of what we did. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So one of my question here, though, Phroxzon, is like about because everyone's thought the champ was over with Prowlers, but that's from my understanding, the champion win rate's very high right now in Master Plus. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that's because the buffs were like pretty damn big.
Just,
like,
they were like
5% buffs.
Because I think that we had that whole conversation about Mythics about how it changes the playstyle on the champ so much. Like I still think Rek'Sai works incredibly well as an assassin, like pure assassin. That's how I play it. I go pure. I build Yomu's into Edge and Knight into Grudge into like GL or something like that, and that's how I have 2Q6. I don't know. Maybe I'm solely responsible for the stats of I'm just breaking this because no one plays Rek'Sai, dude. Like no one really plays Rek'Ai. You know, like I don't in our server in Master Plus, it's like 4 5.
She's pretty damn strong. I just got killed by I just got owned by a Rek'Sai just before coming on the podcast. But yeah, I mean, with her lethality build looks pretty performant. So yeah, I mean, Eclipse or Yomu's looks decent.
Yeah,
I mean, part of that the lack of gap closing functionality with the Prowlers has kind of been solved by the Yomu's in a way, hasn't it? Not fully, but like an element of it.
Yeah, I think Yomu's actually really flexible because I can go in and out. Like sometimes you win fights in League of Legends by going out, right? I can zip away and then like come back in and stuff, right? So because the thing about Prowlers, I think it was a bit clunky in a way because I would lose many games from really advanced, like high-level team fights because I Prowlers onto them and then they flash away and then I'm in them and then I don't. You know what I mean? So now I think that because I'm not able to do that, I win more games and more consistent because I'm not Prowlers into the enemy team.
At the end of the day, no one gives a shit about Rek'Sai.
Yeah, I know. That's just the me thing. People already tuned out of the podcast.
Let's get on to the real champions, all right? No one gives a shit about Rek'Sai, the shitty champion. Let's get on to the real stuff, okay? The juicy. Cassante.
Yeah, let's talk about because you know that meme Phroxzon on Twitter. It's like this champion does this. It's like the perfect champion league. It's like it was broken.
And like how, and this is the thing with Cassante. I want to hear like what was. Okay, so first of all, what were your view on like kind of the presence at MSI with Cassante, and what are some of the challenges you guys face around kind of balancing him for SoloQ versus competitive?
So with Cassante, we kind of agreed let's start with the design goal of like what Cassante was meant to be, right? Like for many years, actually ever, we have never had a skill expressive tank, right? And so Cassante project kind of started with the concept of let's have a skill expressive tank. I mean, I guess you could kind of make an argument that like maybe Sejuani is like somewhat skill expressive. I don't know, like you kind of have to like go in and out or whatever. But like really, if you're trying to make an argument that Sejuani is a skill expressive tank, like it's not really like the pinnacle of skill, right? So we wanted to be like, okay, well, how can we serve tank players by having a skill expressive tank? And we knew from the outset that tanks in general tend to be pretty pro skewed, right? Like people in pro are very good at using tanks. They can limit test. CC is just generally more valuable in pro, this type of thing. And then we also knew that skill expressive is obviously going to be pro skewed, right? So we knew that we were combining two pro skewed elements. And so we were never under the impression that, oh, this champion's going to be balanced for solo queue while being good for pro, right? The design intent was basically, let's make this as best as it can be for solo queue while making sure that it's serving its audience, right? And if that means that the champion has to live at 44% win rate for the average player because 0 to 15 game Cassante has a 40% win rate or something, like, so be it, right? But we would try and do our best with it. Like, obviously we wouldn't be like, let's aim for 38% win rate Cassante for solo queue, right? Like, that's not like a good goal, but it's like we wanted to make it as best as we could. So we were starting from that premise, right? And we were going along in development, and obviously there are things on the kit that are like, okay, these things are skill expressive, but like, do they really need to be there, right? Like, are they really contributing to the Cassante player's fantasy? And that's kind of the approach that we're continuing to take with Cassante, where it's like, okay, he needs to be in a good spot for his enthusiasts, which are basically people who want to play a skill expressive tank. As long as he's serving that purpose and he's like, you know, somewhat viable in pro play, because that's where we would expect him to be his strongest, then we've done a fine job. So it's mainly, we want to make him as best as we can for solo queue, but there's nothing wrong with having a champion that everyone understands is very difficult, that you're rewarded for playing 100, 200, 300,000 games of Cassante, and you're like, actually, no, this silver player that put 1,500 games into Cassante is actually pretty good at them, right? Like, they're not, you know, completely feeding their brains out, and that's a completely fine place for a champion to live. So that's generally our thoughts on it. It's like, let's make sure it serves the primary audience and then make it as good for solo queue as it can be. Basically.
So do you think it's actually even possible? Like
to make a skill expressive tank.
to make us, like, to me, I mean, I'm just coming from the outside, like, it doesn't even really seem logical. Like, why did you guys at Riot even feel like there was a need for a skill expressive tank? Because when you think about the average tank player, you don't really think of them wanting to be skill expressive mechanically anyway. Aren't they really more emphasizing on helping others and being more of a facilitator and thinking more big picture about the game?
Well, I mean, tanks always have this kind of pick rate problem, like, no matter what game it is. Like, WoW, when you're playing, like, you know, like, you're trying to play like the raid finder or whatever, and it's like no one's queuing for tank, like, in whatever thing. And a lot of that is due to, I think, like, how fun the champion is to play, right? And we thought that, hey, like, this would be a cool place that people would be engaged with, and you know, like, people are engaged with playing Cassante, right? And in particular, like, we also knew that tanks tend to get picked in pro play, and, you know, regardless of what you think about, like, Cassante's balance state or whatever, like, he is an exciting champion to watch, like, you know, most of the time, right? And so it's like, okay, well, we know that if pros are going to pick tanks, like, you know, we might as well make an exciting one, right? And so part of it is, I mean, that wasn't the goal. Like, the goal is generally, okay, let's make a skill expressive tank, but we knew that a skill expressive tank is going to be in pro play. So if the thing that he does is also not exciting, then that's, like, probably a failure, right? Like, we don't want a skill expressive tank that's, like, playing DDR at his computer, but he doesn't do anything interesting, right? Like, that's not like cool. We want, if it's hard to do, like, we want it to do something that's, like, visually really striking and really compelling and exciting to watch, right? So that's why Cassante's ult is, like, he just sends them flying across the screen, and then, like, you know, this type of thing. So
I think the ult's really, really cool. I just think, anyway, it's just a very, very, very difficult kit to balance, I think, for solo queue versus.
But I think we have a lot of tools to be able to balance his kit. We just need to. I think people, the copy pasta meme, I think, kind of glosses over the fact that, you know, like, yes, he gets to these points in the game where he can be, like, completely unstoppable, and when he is snowballing and he's, you know, gotten very ahead or whatever, like, he's just kind of ridiculous, right? But, you know, like, for the most part, it's not super worth playing around him, for example, right? Like, he's just generally a kind of stable weak side top laner, right?
Yeah,
like,
you're a facilitator still.
I'm gonna
like,
pummel you into the ground, right?
Yeah.
For the most part. So, you know,
Makes
for every
sense.
game like that where he has 4.7k health, like 1 second airborne, I forgot what the meme was, but like
Yeah,
for every
it's
game
like
like
the
that,
health,
there's like
the
20
dash,
other
the
games where he's
Qs,
just like
the-
completely useless,
And
right?
then like
Q damage.
Showmaker raging at having to play
Yeah.
Kazante every game.
Yeah, yeah.
Moving on to other champions. Aurelion Sol. Now Aurelion Sol is a really interesting champion because I love Aurelion Sol. I think it's a really cool kit. A very tricky one again to balance, and I've noticed that even like this, since it was kind of reworked, there's been many small alterations to ASOL. I saw like nearly every second patch has been a change to ASOL, and he's actually so interesting. So he's actually one of my MLS below gold approved champions because I think he does have like he's very good in the below like the low elo brackets like scaling and
Simple reference points.
very clear reference points and stuff like that. So ASOL, where you guys at with ASOL right now, and what are some of the challenges you guys have been facing with Aurelion Sol, and what are all the reasons behind all the tinkering away with ASOL, and how do you guys view him long term? Like, where is his place in the game in a way?
Yeah, so one thing you might have noticed with a lot of our changes recently has been these types of mage champions in particular. We try and give them kind of like scaling kit passives because we generally expect them to be used, especially if they're like really strong in lane. They tend to get a lot of tempo and snowball the game, and regular players can't really do that very well. So like with, for example, like Syndra or Orianna or Victor, right? Like these types of champions, you just like put your lane opponent in the ground. Like if they're tuned even somewhat reasonably early game, you put your lane opponent in the ground with Corrupting Potion, you get like infinite tempo resets, you're farming 10 CS per minute or whatever. And that's just a pro play staple that's like very boring to watch. And so we generally wanted to figure out, okay, well, when we're making these mage champions, we're designing a dragon. The dragon has to fly. We knew that ASOL previously was extremely elite skewed, right? Like he was completely useless for regular players because of this flying star mechanic, right? And we're like, okay, well, we don't want to like create an elite skewed ASOL, right? Like we're creating this thing that's got a huge visual spectacle. If we then release ASOL and he's elite skewed again, like that's just going to let down the player base really badly, right? So we wanted to go kind of all out on putting as many like low elo skewed things on the kit as possible, right? So it's like the infinite stacking passive, generally low elo skewed. Like low elo players will the game will go infinite, right? And he's going to get a lot of stacks, right? Give him a really weak laning phase, right? Like he's not going to be able to push the tempo of the game, right? Like cap his early like flights, like make it kind of really bad for like flying away, this type of thing. Make a really dodgeable ultimate, right? Like all of these things are very low elo skewed because we didn't want to run the risk of, okay, we re-released ASOL again, we put all of this hype around him being this giant cosmic thing that everyone wants to play, and then he's like only usable by you guys, right? Like that's just kind of a failure, right? So we put all of those things on, and it's been gradually a process of, okay, well, he's really doing well for his target audience, right? Like, if you want to play a scaling mage that, feels like he's in command of the cosmos or in command of like Runeterra, right? Like he certainly feels like that, right? Like if he gets to a gazillion stacks, he's gonna have a black hole that's the size of your screen, right? And that's really cool. So we don't have like a huge amount of interest in like making him a pro play staple or anything like that. It would be nice if we could, but we're not going to like trade off his regular play performance to do so. But then on the flip side, that has meant that he's been very resilient to nerfs because these types of mechanics are like kind of, we don't have a lot of experience in balancing them, right? Like taking this black hole, stack counter down by 5%, like how much performance decreases that? Like nobody knows, right? Or like decreasing the amount of speed that he has when flying or his Q damage. Like all of these things are just really hard to forecast, like how impactful they're going to be. So I think that's kind of why we've had repeated hits to the thing and it hasn't really changed too much. So that's generally where we stand on it, right? Like we like that he's just a generally high fantasy, really cool visual spectacle thing for the average player. And if we can get him into pro play, that's nice. But like, we don't need to. He's like relatively performant in elite play. There's some spots where you're like, okay, I'm not going to get abused in lane. I can stack for free. Maybe it's a good spot for ASOL or Vega or something like that. That's probably where we want to position him.
Yeah, I think you guys did a really good job. I think it's a really awesome champion, and I think it does, like, it has that fantasy feeling when you play it. Like, you actually feel like you're a dragon, and the fact that you can fly over walls. But that does make it. I can see how that can make it tricky to balance, because you think of a champion like Veigar, for example. You know, you have no mobility, so it's kind of very clear. Like, you're kind of capped in the damage output that you have, whereas like an ASOL, where is the effectiveness coming from? Is it coming from the fact that you have this infinite stacking, then you can place this giant thing on the screen? Or is it coming from the fact that he can get to fights when they happen and he can kind of escape from ganks or whatever it might be? You know, I can see how that can be a little bit confusing and take time to adjust. So, yeah.
Yeah, because really good. Especially because, like, let's say, for example, if I really wanted to get ASOL into pro play tomorrow, like, we could, right? Like, we know all the levers that we would use to tune it. We would give him a strong laning phase. We would amp up his ability to roam in the early game. We would make his ult less dodgeable but deal less damage. You know, these types of things. Like, we know exactly what we would need to do to get him into pro play. We just don't really have much interest. Like, it doesn't really serve his audience very well.
I agree.
To have him be back into this, like, kind of elite only, you know, spinning star flying dude that's always roaming around. Like, that's not.
Yeah. But on that topic, no, it's really interesting.
Character.
I like what you said about, I haven't really thought of it like that. You guys have incrementally kind of changed the direction of all mages to be more scaling. Like, think about Syndra is a huge one now, obviously more scaling, and I really like the direction of that because, again, a lot more. Syndra's now way more accessible to the average player. Like, Syndra, I remember back in the day, I would cringe when a gold player would play Syndra. It's just not possible. But then now the average gold player can play Syndra because they don't need to hit every single Q in lane to have success. They can sit there, relax. They don't need to bully their lane opponent. They can skill and they can chill and scale. Same thing with Talia.
Yeah, like
Talia as well. Talia also hardcore mid to late game scaling. Even like, Victor, again, good scaling. A lot like, Veigar, ASOL, like a lot of the mages nowadays, they just kind of very, very geared. Yeah, they geared way more. You're rewarded a lot more for farming well and being a little more poised rather than having to shit on your opponent early. Like, if you think of like a lot of these champions, you had to really get ahead early, and it felt like you couldn't kind of make up for the difference later on. But nowadays it feels like you definitely can. Even Ahri to a certain degree, like nowadays you look at the best players with Ahri, they don't farm 6 CS per minute and roam around the map. They value their farm. They value themselves as a carry. You know, a strong carry heading into the mid to late game. But I actually do like that. I actually really like the direction. It feels good.
We want a good mix, right? Yeah, like, we want a good mix of champions that can play well in the early game and play well in the late game, right? Like, you know, we want Syndra. Syndra's a bit of a edge case because she's kind of good. She's kind of like about average, like, across all axes, right? Like, she's not exactly the early lane bully thing for us, maybe. Oh no, I see you blinking. And then we have, you know, we want some champions like Azir or whatever that can scale, Victor, etc. But yeah, generally speaking, it's like we want to have a good mix. Previously, we only had basically all the champions that were in mid lane that were mages were all of these high tempo, you need to win the game instantly kind of like Talia. I push and roam, and then, or like ASOL, I push and roam, or like Victor Oriana as tuned previously, were like I completely annihilate you in lane. Like, same with Azir. It's like,
or Syndra, even Azir. Like, Azir's changed completely Syndra,
as well. Victor Oriana, it's like.
Azir's been actually a very tricky one for me to figure out in my program in terms of like how the best way to play that champion. Like, right now there's a lot of Azir mains, and so I've actually been digging really deep on Azir at the moment, trying to actually figure out what exactly is Azir's identity. And he's such a complex, like an incredibly complex champion, like unbelievably complex.
I wouldn't even know I don't even know what the identity of the champion is.
Azir. Okay, and I'd love to get your take on this. So this is my current interpretation of Azir and like the way I think of him. So Azir used to be, you know, very geared towards landing Qs in lane, poking down the enemy. You'd be rewarded for even taking more lane dominant runes like Halo Blades and Comet, kind of shitting on the enemy, like old Syndra and stuff like that. Like, really trying to shit on your opponent, get a lead early. Nowadays, now they've shifted the damage, right, more towards the soldiers and the W rather than the Q. So you can't just spam Q in lane. So you need to be more patient. You kind of need level 7. You need Lost Chapter. You need like multiple levels in your W before you can actually really do anything. And where the complexity comes in with Azir, which is why he's so difficult to kind of master and teach, is that you need to know, okay, is the best decision here to sit back, pump out damage with my soldiers in a front to back team fight, and then wait and hold my R for like peel? Or is it better for me to kind of sit on the edge and then look for an engage window with my WEQR and then get a pick? He's like this weird hybrid between like a pick champion that has really, really good gank setup, or really good creative pick windows, but then also a high DPS kind of quote unquote scaling mage that can kind of sit front to back and pump out damage. And right now he has such versatile builds. You'll see like First Strike, you'll see Conqueror, you'll see Lethal Tempo, you'll see Ludens, you'll see Leandries, Nash's Rush. There's like so many different interpretations of the champion. And for the average player playing him, like I feel like even when they play, like I teach some gold, platinum players who play the champion, like I feel like they don't even really understand what the champion really is all about. And they have this idea that I'm Azir, I'm going to sit back and farm the 2-3 items and scale. But that's not really exactly the case with Azir, because you have all this utility with your R and your gap closing, ability with your E and stuff. He's an incredibly complex champion to teach, with just so multifaceted. So how, obviously, Azir has always been kind of like a top-heavy champion. Like, it's not really
competitive.
More of a competitive champion.
Azir Corki meta always pops up.
Yeah, Azir Corki and stuff like that. So how are you guys thinking of Azir, like more big picture in the lower elo brackets and all that? Or has that even been part of your discussion right now?
Yeah, it has. I mean, one of the changes. So we did a large amount of changes to Azir, as I'm sure you know. But Azir's flexibility has always been challenging for us, right? Like as you mentioned, he was historically this dude that playing lane against Azir or playing as Azir is just incredibly oppressive. Like there's no other word for it, right? Like it was probably the most oppressive because he's the highest range, and all of you're slowed and all of this, while also having a really good scaling, while also having an escape, while also having an engage. Like he just had everything, right? And so it's like, but that's also what Azir players love about it, right? And so the challenge then becomes, how can we turn this champion that has all of these things into something that is usable for the average player, right? And that's really hard, because pro players, like you said, are going to identify the games where it's like, okay, well, here I need to play fast because my team is Rek'Sai, Draven.
I don't know, frontline.
I don't know, like Nautilus or something, right? And we don't scale. So if I'm sitting here and playing for 2-3 items, it's probably not right, right? Like I should be taking Hail Blades or taking whatever, and trying to snowball the early mid game. Or maybe you're playing a comp where it's like, okay, well, I can get bridged into late game. Like they can stall for me to get into late game, so I'm going to play, the Legendaries slower, lethal tempo, conqueror like style. And it's like, balancing that type of champion is really difficult, right? Because, there are so many different ways to play it. The thing that I was saying earlier, though, about mages and this type of champion being very oppressive in the early game was the thing that we knew was like off about this champion. Like for a champion that has this many strengths like inbuilt into their kit, and we didn't really want to touch any of those. Like some of the explorations we've done previously are like, well, what if Azir can't Shurima shuffle people? And it's like, well, that's not Azir anymore. Or it's like, well, what if Azir just doesn't have very good DPS in the late game? It's like, well, that's not really Azir either anymore, right? And so it's like, okay, well, if we need to keep both of those, then he also just can't have a god tier laning phase, right? And the way that we wanted to achieve that was, okay, well, the Q uptime, like the amount of range that you have over opponents and the amount of threat that you can exert, right? Like by the time you Q and then the opponent has a window to play back, like it Q's back up again, right? Like that's probably clearly off, right? And so we're like, okay, well, how about we retune his abilities in a way that he's more range restricted, so he can actually be punished by certain champions, and he's going to be most effective into like melee or short range champions, or like an Ari or something, because he can like actually W in range of her. And so it's like, okay, well, let's move him away from Q max and move him into W max, and that's basically the only way that we'll be able to balance him, right? And so that's what we did, and I think it's made him a little more balanceable. We'll see how that plays out over time. And then we had to do a bunch of finagling around with his other abilities and so on to make that balanced. But the idea was, how can we keep these two core identities that Azir players really like, and it would make no sense to like divorce the two. Like if we can't get rid of Shroom Shuffle and we can't get rid of him being like a scaling Emperor dude that commands a lot of soldiers and is a late game threat. So the only option we have basically is to like kind of crater his laning phase in a way, or make it more polarized at least. So that's the route that we chose.
Interesting.
And I think it's like, it'll make him a little more performant for average players. Like they're not leaving infinite value on the table if they're not, Q spamming on somebody like they were before, because you just don't have that option, right? So we hope that that's gonna be able to retain both of those playstyles that Azir players like.
Okay, and one more mid champion, Nathan. I know I'm going through a lot of mid champs here.
I mean, Phroxzon plays mid. This is just a mid podcast at this point.
I know.
Anyway, so
Everyone else can tune out.
I mean, I can talk about anything, but yeah.
Last mid champ, Annie.
Yep.
Annie, I think, is just an incredibly strong champion and has been for a while now. And we also saw a lot of the priority on Annie at MSI as well. Annie's such an interesting champion. Like I feel like she's top heavy skewed and then low elo skewed in a way where like you see her a lot in like the lower elo brackets and then you see her at the kind of the top elo brackets. So Annie, she actually did receive a nerf recently, right? I think there was a nerf to like her E or something. What was the nerf to? I can't remember.
Q damage.
Q damage, right? So where are you guys at with Annie right now? Yeah, so walk us through, because Annie obviously has such good effect or such good synergy with First Strike, and the way she can reliably proc First Strike with the E, and which makes her incredibly good at scaling, and the utility she has in her kit, and the E kind of is probably one of the best abilities in the game. How are you guys viewing Annie, and are you guys happy with where Annie is at right now in her current strength?
Yeah, so I'll start with things that I like and the team likes about Annie. First is she can be played in multiple roles, right? Like we've always had the Annie support audience that has always been asking us to be able to play Annie support, and she seems pretty viable there. And she seems viable in mid, obviously. The other thing that we like is that she sees some play at high elo. Like she kind of used to be a bit of a joke at high elo before. So those are the things that we like, and we needed to make some specific changes to get her in there. So like, I was talking a bit before about how we know a lot about certain changes that we can make to given champions and what they do in different skill brackets. So move speed is an example of something that is very potent in higher skill brackets, but not that potent in lower skill brackets, as is on-demand shielding. So we knew that, okay, well, if we make her shielding and move speed, high elo players are much better at finding angles for engagements with the move speed and escaping from ganks and things like that, or like using the shields correctly and even using shields on allies and stuff like that. So we're like, okay, well, we know that we can make this pretty powerful. And I think the change that kind of pushed her overboard was like Tibber's health. That was like kind of a lot. But like I think we generally like the position that she's in the game. Like she's probably a little overtuned still, even after the Q change, if I had to guess. But yeah, it's important that we have a champion that can play kind of for the early game. I think the only thing that we don't, and it's also very important that we have kind of point and click CC, like on demand CC, because that plays an important role in not allowing certain types of champion archetypes to like run rampant. Like let's say, for example, if you're playing against like some dude that's like just dashing around constantly, right? You want someone like Annie, or you want someone like Lissandra, and it's important that those champions are in the meta, like Lissandra, Annie, Vi, some assortment of those, like Nautilus ult. This type of thing is really important to keep in the meta to make sure that it's not like, Zeri or Lucian or whatever is just get out of control, right? So those are things we like. Things that we don't like, I think one optimization that I don't love is the ulting someone randomly just to get first strike gold. Like that's, like
that's all I do.
I mean, it is a way to play the rune, right? Like that's how you're meant to optimize the rune, but like something's wrong about the tuning if she's just constantly doing that, right? And the other thing that I don't like is her ulting the wave and just zoning you with the bear while like going off to recall. Like that's also like kind of degenerate. So those are two areas that I don't love.
Yeah,
and
because
we may look
that's kind of
into,
feels like
but
that's
I'm
the stock.
not super sure.
That's the stock standard way to play Annie right now. This is what I tell my clients: is like you get 6, you farm to 6, take first strike. As soon as you hit 6, you walk up, you press E, you R, you get 50 gold, and then you get complete lane control. You zone them, you do whatever you want. You have full tempo now for a while. They either have to burn TP or whatever. If they don't have TP, they're screwed. And then you're done, and then you get free scale. And then wait till Tippers goes away. That's going to stay for a while. Get it again, do it again. And you just get complete and utter, especially in like the lower elo brackets, they're not going to tether the R. You just get complete lane control. So I view it right now with First Strike. I think she's in a very, very good position. If she's played well. And I feel like right now it's weird. People haven't really caught on to what Annie is. I don't think Annie is early game. I think Annie is pure mid to late game. Like, I think she's a hyper scaling mid to late game champion. You go First Strike, you get really far ahead of the curve. You have incredible damage in team fights. You have item flexibility with Legendaries. You can even go Rockabot if you need to, but you have incredible scaling with depending on the build you go. And then you're like this absolute menace in mid to late game fights, if picked in the right situation. But for the most part, I think that like that TP with First Strike and playing R for lane control is just like this very, very, very reliable way of playing the champion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like, when I say early game, it's kind of like she is able to drive the tempo of the game, I suppose, in a way, right? Like you are able to, it's not like, I don't know, let's say you're playing Victor or something, right? Like, and you're playing against some I don't know, some champ that's like able to run the game, right? Like you're just sitting at your tower while the other person's doing something, right? Like Annie's on the opposite side of that. She's the one driving the pace of the game. Like if she wants the game to be played slow, like she can play it slow, and if she wants the game to be played fast, she can play it fast.
That's true.
So that's kind of what I think in terms of like early game, and most of the time that probably just means, okay, yeah, I can like scale and get tempo and get side lanes ahead or get a lot of river control or whatever, and just like farm and get first strike econ advantage. But sometimes if it's like, okay, well now I could just constantly force them to recall or zone them with the bear while I'm off doing other stuff, right? Like it's up to her. So
okay. All right, we've spoken a lot about mid lane.
I want to know where are we at with Yuumi, Phroxzon? What's going on? What's Yuumi? What are we doing here? We had the is it
Zeri Yuumi?
The Zeri Yuumi thing, is obviously a big thing that the community is very outspoken about since her release. Yuumi obviously had that rework, with the Q angling and stuff. Like, where are we at? Like, is this champion a problem for you guys to balance?
I mean, it has been a problem, has been difficult to balance. I would say she's in a pretty good spot right now, right? I think one of the things that we've is kind of unclear to the community is the idea that Yuumi can be good for beginning players while also having bad SoloQ metrics, right? And, because SoloQ players are not new players, right? When we're talking about new players, we're talking about, okay, I'm bringing my completely new to MOBA friend into the game, and they're playing Yuumi, and they literally don't know what any character does. They don't even know how to cast their abilities, right? I probably want them to just be sitting on me while I'm playing Lucian, and they play Yuumi, and they just press their buttons, right?
Yeah, I know Yumi's 450 in the store now. It was 6,300 for new players. That is obviously very intentional. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what people will do is they will be like, well, that can't possibly be true because I look on LoLlytics, and for bronze players, she's 44% win rate, and it's like, well, that's not the target audience, right? It is kind of the target audience, but like not really, right? Like we first and foremost want to balance Yuumi around being great for bringing a player into the game because she's by far the best performing champion at that, and it's not close. Like the second best person I believe is like Leona or Teemo or Nautilus or something, and Yuumi is just like miles ahead of all of those in terms of like actual performance metrics because you can just sit on your friend while they're teaching you the game, right? It's like, this is how you cast your Q, this is how you cast your E. And there's a really big audience for that, right? Like even at this low win rate, like Yuumi still even has in ranked play like a pretty high pick rate, like at 46% or something, she's still like 6% pick rate or something, right? Which is quite high. For SoloQ though, and Pro, like the things that we didn't like was Yumi's best skill bracket being Pro. Like this is really wrong, right? Like we didn't want that, and it was part of the effort to kind of make Yumi's counterplay more in line with what players expected. So the whole thing was we tried the experiment of, okay, the community wants to be able to have Yuumi pop out and be able to punish her. It's like, okay, well, let's try and make that more of a thing, right? So what we did is we reduced the cooldown of the passive. So it's like she has to hop out more to optimize this. Turns out that only pro players could really optimize that. And it was, it was pretty antithetical to what a Yuumi player, wants to do. Like if I'm playing with a completely new friend, I don't want them hopping out every 8 seconds, like and potentially dying instantly, like to proc this passive, right? Like that's not really what I want my friend to be doing when they're trying to learn to play the game. I want them to be pressing their buttons and doing this stuff, right? So we kind of decided, okay, well, we're not gonna go that direction. If we're gonna keep the attach, then we're going to make her abilities while she's attached have more counterplay. So this is removing the root of the ult. This is lowering the speed of the Q. This is increasing the mana cost of the Q. This is changing the benefits that she gets when she's attached, that are a little more niche to certain champions, making her not have to jump onto Wukong and Vi and Viego and stuff to be effective, and have her bind more to her lane partner. So these were all things that we did in the rework, and I think we're generally pretty reasonable. I think they've gone relatively well. And the thing that was just a problem was that when we did these changes, she released Overpowered, and she kind of sat like that for a few patches. So I think that was the main problem. We should have just taken her back down, because we were like, oh well, what? Maybe she's okay at 50% win rate, but it turns out that she wasn't. So she's hovering closer to 47 now, and that's totally fine. That's totally fine for a champion to sit at if she's not going to see a lot of pro play, which at least early indications for 13-12 are that she hasn't been seeing much play at all. So signs are promising, at least.
Is this a is this a possibility, Phroxzon? Ever is there a world where again, Yuumi might be this specific case where Riot say we're actually going to ban a specific champion in Master Tier Plus or Pro Play? Was that let's say if your intention of the champion is literally just this is a new player champion? Is that a thing that you guys would do or consider, or is that just never going to be on the cards?
I wouldn't say never, but I would say it's very close to never. We highly value a regular player being able to log into League of Legends and watch Faker play a game, and the game that they are playing is the same as the game that Faker's playing, right? And that's one of our very core values, and so I feel like that would be directly undermining it, because it's always the first one, right? Making that first decision is always the most difficult one. As soon as the precedent's set, then it's like, okay, well, let's now disable this person and disable this person and whatever. So we have to have an incredibly high bar to be able to disable any champion for any skill bracket. And I don't think even at her worst, Yuumi or Zeri were particularly close to that.
The only
close to reworking for sure, but not disabling.
Yeah, because that's the only other thought I had. The only other thought I had was, when we were going through this conversation, was I wonder if it would be possible to have different iterations. Like, how in ARAM, you have the different stats for a different champion. You're talking about as in pro play, they could utilize the 8-second passive thing on Yuumi. I wonder if you could maybe disable that altogether for normal games or people that are below level 30, or there's slight alterations made to the kits to simplify their identity or their decision making fatigue for the new beginner players. So you're not really removing the champ; they're still playing the same champ, but they're simpler in a way. Would that ever be something that Riot would consider?
I think we wouldn't consider it on the kit level, but we might consider it at the map level, if that makes sense. So I could very easily see a situation where it's actually, Summoner's Rift is just too complicated. At a baseline, Summoner's Rift is just too complicated. So let's make a simpler, more streamlined version of Summoner's Rift. I could certainly see that being a learning thing, and it's just a different queue, right? It's learning queue or something. And the map is simplified. Maybe it's a bit smaller. Maybe the towers deal less damage, similar to Dota's easy mode. I don't know if you guys played Dota before, but
we learned a lot of games through 3v3s, Twisted Tree Line.
Yeah, we played 3v3.
We played a lot. That's how we probably learned a lot of the game through Twisted Tree Line. which is
Yeah,
interesting.
but I think we wouldn't go so far as to change the actual functionality of the champion between queues, even between ARAM and SR. But I think like for Yuumi, like it's, you know, like if this doesn't work, then it's like, okay, well, I have a pretty strong suspicion that what we have right now, the kit as it's currently constructed with a bit of tuning, will be able to get there. Like it'll just be able to sit at 46, 47, and she'll be completely fine. And the people who like to play Yuumi will play her, and she'll be great for new players. And I think that's a fine spot for a champion to sit. If this doesn't work and she still is a pro play staple for whatever reason, then, you know, we might have to consider, okay, well, this attach, you know, we've done the best that we can with it, but maybe she just has to play more like a normal support champion. Maybe, right? Like it would at least be on the table. It would be something to discuss, because the current attach mechanism we've kind of pushed to the limit in terms of like using all of our, you know, expertise to try and
everything the
balance
Arsenal. You've tried. That's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
is there a point where it's like, this is just not working? We've got to do some drastic things that we've never done in League before with this champion.
Yeah, but I have reasonable confidence that the current one, like we have actually resolved a good amount of the issues that were not present before, like the whole her jumping onto Wukong or like Viego or whatever. Like,
Oh yeah, you did a really good job of
Like,
that. I don't see like Yuumi Kane ruining a game.
Yuumi Hecarim and
Yuumi
stuff like
Hecarim.
that. Yeah.
Like that's really, really good.
Right. And her Q is a lot more dodgeable. Her laning phase is a lot more abusable. Like her ult doesn't root you anymore. This type of thing. Like her playmaking ability is like pretty significantly reduced. She just does play more like a very typical enchanter now, which has its weaknesses, right? Like if you catch her out, you know, they're probably going to die, right? Unless they're in Zeri, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
So do you want to get to the gameplay stuff, Nathan?
I wanted to talk about another support champ, the recent Milio release. We talked about in our last episode how you intentionally make champions super overtuned when they get released, so then people can play them, so you can get stats, so you can like work your way backwards.
Well, we release them at what we think is an appropriate balance level. We try to. We used to release them overtuned, but now we try to release them at what we think is about balanced, or at least at about balance that will like teach us something, right? Like what we suspect is balanced, knowing that we might need to change a certain thing. Like for example, Milio has pretty good damage for an enchanter, while also having some, you know, very best in class enchanter outputs like range extension and the cleanse, right? And so it's like, can these coexist on a kit? Like we're not sure. We're not intentionally releasing them overtuned, though we have a suspicion that if there's something's going to be a problem, it might be a combination of these three. So that's, you know, like we don't know. Like, and, you know, we have a strong suspicion, but ultimately at the end of the day, like, even though our internal testers are very good, right? Like they're like mix of like GM challenger players, some of them, right? Like they're not Faker, right? Like it's Faker and Carrier are going to push this thing to the limits more than we could ever possibly do, right?
So because support is really interesting, because it's sort of like the same thing with Yuumi Zeri. How like, do you like think about when you release a support champion? Because Lucian Milio, that was very, very, very strong when in the initial release. Do you think about how this support champion introduced to the game is going to make a complement an AD carry? Like, is that something you think about?
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah.
We think about, especially when we're in the middle of, because let's say, for example, we were testing this range extension mechanic, right? At some point in development, we would be saying, okay, is this sustainable? Like, what is going to break if we add this mechanic into the game, basically? And so then we'll get all these people into the room, basically, or whoever's working on the thing will get a brainstorm going and be like, okay, well, what are the most, you know, insane combinations that you can think of when you're, if you were trying to abuse this or trying to break this completely, what would you pair it with? Lucian's one of them. Caitlyn's another one, right? It's like, okay, if you have like a lot of range, like what happens if you have even more range, right? Like, does that just become like extremely oppressive, like to the point where you can't even play against it, right? Or like Jinx or something, right? Like someone who's really high range. And so we'll run some specific like tests in games where we'll be like, okay, well, let's set up like the best possible case for a Milio game, right? And does this feel like reasonable to play against, right? This type of thing. It's like, okay, well, what if we did Caitlyn with like Ivern jungle, Karma mid, Milio bot, and like a tank in top lane, right? Like, is that just like extremely impressive, right? And it's like we test it, it's like, it's actually not that bad, right? Like it's annoying for sure, right? But is it like breaking the game? Like, not really, right?
Zero
So that's the
counterplay.
type of testing that we'll do to figure out if the thing is going to break. We have like some specific hypotheses that we think are going to go wrong, and then we'll like try and focus test it. Obviously, like there's only so much time in the day, so we can, and so many other factors could be playing into that, right? Like the Karma mid could have just gone like 0-6 or whatever. Like,
Yeah, that'd
like,
be so hard. That'd be so incredibly hard to test. And on this testing thing, now Neeko was a very unique design. Very, very unique.
Yep.
And I remember when I saw the images or whatever when it came out, I was like, Neeko can turn into like a Scryer's Bloom
Minion,
or
wait,
a
Minion.
Blast Cone. And I was like, this is not real. Like I thought it was like one of those meme things, you know? And when I saw it, I was like, wow, that's so unique. Like that's such a cool thing. And so, you were thinking before, you were talking about that process before, how you kind of look, okay, what's like the most broken thing? How can we break the game with Neeko? What was that experience like, kind of trying to break the game with Neeko? And again, what were some of the fears you guys had about Neeko? Or did you kind of see the whole passive as like a bit of a, not really the main aspect of the changes to Neeko, and it's more of like a side thing? Like,
well, we certainly thought that we didn't think that the disguise changes would be as effective in pro play as they were. I'll say that much. Like pro players seem to be really bad at counting minions for whatever reason. And it's like, oh, 4 melee minions? Oh, let me just like walk up to this.
Yeah.
Just like get like destroyed by it. So that was one thing. Or like, let's say like a moving control ward. It's like, no one's possibly going to get fooled by this, right? But like, people were just like falling for it, right? And that was kind of cool. Like we never really expected that to actually manifest. At least at the tip top level. I think the changes, because Neeko was always a strong laner, but she was just so impotent in the mid to late game that it was just kind of like, there wasn't much point getting the tempo in the early game or getting the lane control. But then as soon as we changed the ultimate, I think that's what
that
made
was the big change
to make it more reliable. Yeah. That was the thing that actually pushed her over the edge, I think. And so, we were just like, okay, well, it's fine for her to have a good ultimate. She just doesn't need to have best in class laning phase to combo with that. And then I think she's in a good spot. I think the thing that kind of they might be on Twitter actually, like some of the early clips in dev of like me getting killed by the thing on like TrueXY's Twitter, but yeah, basically like because the tech was really janky, right? Like on the mini map you would see like this big white square because the texture like couldn't be rendered, like it wouldn't be able to find the picture of the image, like if you turn into a control ward or something. It's like, how do you even put that on the mini map? So it'd just be this big white square, so it was really obvious when she's disguised because on the mini map she's just this really big white square. So once we fixed that, which was quite challenging to fix, then it got a lot more deceptive. And I remember like I was sweeping and I was like killing this control ward, and then like suddenly it turned into Neeko and then just killed me, and then I was like, oh, okay, like I guess I gotta be like really scared of like every control ward I ran into, right? There are a few situations like that, but I think it wasn't as extensive as like Milio testing in terms of like, because firstly we didn't think that people at the highest level were going to fall for this thing, right? Like we were just like, oh, okay, well, if the control ward's moving, like control ward was like the edge abuse case, if you could even call it an abuse case that we could think of, where it's just like, okay, well, you just pretend to be a control ward and then they go to clear the control ward and then you actually Neeko, right? Like that's,
I think the W changes were also quite
abusive.
Nice. The W changes the Neeko.
Yeah.
I think like the fact that the Neeko could recall, you could like start the Neeko recall and things like that. Like those, I think those actually things made a very big difference, and you can kind of control the Neeko, because it felt like Neeko W before was so shit. Like it was really wasn't really useful, but like it's actually an incredibly good ability if used properly now by, if you're a competent, like I think Neeko now is in such a good spot because it has this incredibly high skill cap. The R was probably the thing that was probably put it over the edge, but I actually do like the direction of Neeko, because Neeko before it felt like a very outdated champion. You know how we were talking before about how Neeko was that generation of champion that had to get this like crazy lead early, but then fell off an absolute cliff because you couldn't even get your damage off. But now it always feels like, okay, you have the early lane strength, but now you're not a minion in the Or you are theoretically a minion if you want to be a minion, but you're not an actual minion in the mid to late game. So yeah, I do like the changes for Neeko. I thought it was very unique, but yeah, it just definitely needed to be hot fixed. I think changed a little bit earlier, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I think we also the alt disguise time. I think we're changing this patch, or we changed last patch, or 13-13 we changed it. It's a little much to be disguised, I think, for the whole 1.25 seconds. So, and I think even pros couldn't really react to it, which kind of made sense. So we're tuning that down a little bit, and I think that she'll be in a really good spot after that.
Game?
Let's move into overall game changes.
Also,
now.
I want to start with TP. I think the TP changes were interesting. So far from the data, what's been the data like with TP, like in terms of pick rate with TP? Because in my program, I don't know, this is my program, like you have to have an incredibly good reason at the moment to not take Ignite. I almost feel like you're really not incentivized to take a combat spell in many scenarios, and I feel like TP is just incredibly strong. I feel like since the empowered TP comes up now at 10 minutes. So where are you guys at with TP right now in terms of balance relative to combat spells, combat summoners?
I mean, these are big changes. Like, how do you guys talk about these? These are like, that's a huge change.
It's a massive change.
Go from 14 minutes to 10. Like, that changes
4
the
minutes.
dynamic of the game. Like, I'm just bringing like, not even to get specific. Like, how do you guys make a decision like that? You guys sit around the table like saying, we want to increase the pace of the game. We want them to fight the second drag fight. Like, these are massive gameplay changes. Or you don't think so?
So this was the TP change was kind of brought about by thinking about top lane. Like, we were in a very bot focused meta at the time, and we thought, oh well, at the time mid lane gold was still nerfed, right? So mid lane was not actually as strong as it had been in times past as well. And so we're like, okay, well, mid can afford to get a little bit of a buff from the TP, and it would be a way to kind of increase the strength of solo laners. And in particular, we wanted to choose a timing that was relevant for around second dragon fights. So we didn't want it to be, because for example, we could have said, okay, well, actually you get unleashed TP at 5 minutes, right? But the reason we chose 10 minutes was, okay, 14 minutes feels too late, 5 minutes feels too early, and we want to choose roughly a time when top laners feel like they would be able to have influence over the game outcome. And that was roughly around second dragon, right?
Second dragon.
After Rift Herald spawned, and you've probably done the dance around Rift Herald, and you've gone back to top lane, and you have an opportunity to, potentially impact the basically next big fight around bot without having to sack too much by just running to dragon because you run to dragon and they just waste your time, and then you're like, oh crap, I have to like TP back to top, this type of thing. So that was the intention behind the changes, and we knew there was going to be some collateral with mid lane, but mid lane at the time was in a state where it wasn't the most powerful as it's ever been, so we thought that it could go up a little bit. And also, to your point, like in regular play, TP just underperforms relative to other spells, except in elite play, where obviously TP is a lot better because you play for tempo and you just like exhaust their mana pool and then get a tempo reset and then TP back to lane and whatever, right? Like this type of thing doesn't really happen in silver or gold, like as I'm sure you know. So challenging spell to balance, I think, but it creates a lot of really interesting things in the mid to late game, especially like TP flanks, allowing for split pushing. Like it enables a lot of things that we like in the game. So we wouldn't want to remove it, but we need to find a way to basically not have top laners be purely beholden to having the spell to be able to participate in the game. So that's an ongoing design challenge.
I think
that's sure how we're meant to go about that.
The TP changes in combination with sweeper as well, I think made it a lot easier. I feel like it's a lot harder to clear vision as well, or you need to be a lot more intentional
with the vision clearing.
Which I do like. I do like that. Yeah. I actually do like the sweeper changes. I think it does make sense, but that in combination with TP, it just feels like there's a lot more like action, especially a lot more action in bot side, which I guess, I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, just, stating it as it is. I personally don't mind it. I think it's kind of exciting for the game, right? But, yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys think the sweeper changes were a buff to vision denial or a nerf to vision denial?
Well, it rewards again intention. Like you've got to be very strategic with. So I'd
think
say
it's
it scales with
it's
the better the player.
It's
right?
a bit of a nerf for the average player.
Yeah, I think it's nerf for the average player. Yeah.
Do you think it's a buff for the skilled player?
I think that is
Or about the
perfectly
same?
balanced because the times are
I think
so
it's
short.
good. I think it's really good.
You know what I mean? I wouldn't really call it that. I think it's just better to punish you more so, but it's just basically if you use it like you did last time, you know, if you at the end of the day, you know, high level players, they have very intentional where clearing a section to control that gives us midway, you know what I mean? So that doesn't really change the amount of time really because we're going to be able to clear enough wards already with that.
I actually think trinkets are very nice at the moment. I actually really like the change to Believe in the Blue trinket with the ping as well, where you know, it comes with the ping. I think it was really nice.
I want to talk about the gameplay change that was really out of the blue. I didn't understand it. I want to get what the thought process about the minion wave timing stuff. Everyone was like sort of losing their minds around that, and didn't you guys just end up reverting that as well? Like, I mean, I'm a jungler, so
No, it's
is it still?
Nah,
in the
they-
game?
no, they
which one?
reverted-
Which one are you talking about? Are you talking about the gold, the mid
They
lane
reverted
gold,
the
or are you
gold.
talking about the?
Right?
We reverted the gold. We
Yeah.
didn't revert the
timing.
timing changes.
Okay, because I'm a jungler.
I mean, the whole point of the timing changes is to protect side lanes more.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm a jungler and I purely play around. I play only early game junglers. I purely play around waves, and none of my decision making changed whatsoever. Like I can't even think about times of the game and stuff like that. Like I didn't even notice the change was in play.
I think it's an incremental change, right? Like, so the intention of the change is previously mid lane crashed first, right? So as a mid laner, if I'm stacking a wave or whatever, then I can crash my wave, move to side, and then by the time I get to side, their wave will be crashing. So it's just really optimal pathing for me because then the mid lane opponent is in a really bad position, right? With the change, if the waves are crashing at the same time, then if the top laner that's getting dived or the bot laner that's getting dived manages to clear the wave, they have more time to be able to avoid the gank, basically. It's not going to, you know, if they're losing, it's still going to happen the same way, right? Because, you know, someone's still going to just be stacking a wave and crashing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I feel like
and they have control over that. But if you are winning your lane, you can prevent yourself from getting dived a little easier. You have like, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds more to be able to defend yourself.
It's
right?
really
To
a
clear the
minor
wave.
change in the grand scheme of things because in the majority of games, at least, you know, nowadays, you know, dives don't happen off one wave stacks anyway. They happen a lot of the time off multiple wave stacks.
That's
so a lot of the time, it doesn't really. I mean, I think people were over exaggerating that change when the actual notes came out because when I thought about it in practicality. In my games, when I'm looking at it, or even in the average game, even like in a platinum game, you look at dives, when there's one wave, the dive doesn't happen anyway, fizzles out. They get halfway, they realize that the wave's not big enough, and they're going to go back mid anyway, even before the minion changes. Dives were only going to ever happen when a lane, it was either in full control or they were taking such bad trades that you didn't need a wave, barely needed a wave anyway.
That's right. You'll be able to make that dive anyway.
You'd be able to
for
make
too
the
low
dive
HP.
anyway.
Yeah.
So it's in my opinion, it was such a minuscule change, at least from a mid perspective, and what I've noticed in my program, it hasn't really changed. Like people who play roamers and people who don't play roamers, it's made no difference, at least from my perspective.
Well, you said it's incremental, so you guys looking to play with this more, like, because this is again really interesting.
Well, it's more in the sense that we didn't think. Well, one, if we changed it in a way that dives never happened on the side lanes, that would be bad.
That's very bad. Yeah, we can't have
because
that.
it's removing some strategy.
Yeah.
At the same time, if dives always happen, then that's also bad, right? So it's a middle ground. So like, let's say for example, the average play when you're stacking a wave and you're crashing it into top tower, you would have 12 minions, right? And with the change, maybe there would be 10 minions, right? And that might make the difference sometimes, right? Like if you're fighting back against the wave and you're trying to clear the wave, like let's say you're playing Scion or something, and you know they're pushing this 12 stack minion wave in, and with the change, it was instead of being 12, it's 10 minions, right? Maybe that buys you 1 or 2 extra seconds of them getting hit by the turret, right? So it's like it's an incremental change.
Yeah,
it's meant to
very
help a little
small
bit.
things, yeah.
And the other change that we did that because we felt like generally that people were getting dived too freely on sides. Like it was a little too guaranteed, like especially at optimal play. And the other thing that we did to kind of incentivize dive counterplay was that as soon as the minions get into turret range, they aggro onto the turret. Because one thing that would happen is, let's say you're the Scion and you're trying to fight back, you fight back and then you draw the minion aggro, then the minions are just trucking you, right? So, that kind of felt off. If you're crashing a 12 stack minion wave into them, like you also don't need to be hitting them with minion aggro as well. Like we felt like that was a bit excessive in terms of dive strength. So we wanted to nerf that a little bit as well. So now when the minions go into the tower, they aggro into the tower. So both those changes combined, I think, reduce the incidence of dives by a little bit, like successful dives. You need to play a little better around coordinating your dive, and it's a little less free than it was before. But for the most part, you wouldn't really notice a large difference unless you were comparing like A to B. It's like, oh, I had 12 minions in this exact scenario in the previous patch, and now I have 9.5 minions, right? Like no one's doing that.
Yeah, no.
But that's factually what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So I got a question from someone. This was from my community asked this question. How do you guys feel, right, about the cadence of balance changes in Season 13 so far? It's not the first time we've had a big mid-season patch, but it felt a little awkward having huge changes only a couple of patches before the end of the new rank split. Maybe it's hard to coordinate in advance around play schedules, rank schedule, Riot, summer break, etc. But I'm mainly wondering if they have any learnings that will apply for next split or next year, or if they're just happy with the outcome.
Yeah, so it was a little difficult to coordinate this year. Like, I think, like I said, the gameplay teams and the rank team are separate teams and requires some coordination to get that going. And we had intended because the whole point of like doing a ranked reset, ideally, is that comes with some gameplay changes, right? Like that's why we reset the ranks at preseason, right? So you're playing a different game. So it's a little awkward if the changes come right before the end of the season, right before the end of the split.
Yeah.
Having said that, like I felt like we had a good amount of time to stabilize. Like if you're climbing now in this last week, like it's pretty reasonable. Like the patch feels all right. But ideally, we would like to release the changes and then reset the ranks. Like that would be ideal. But for whatever reason, our like timelines got desynced a little. Whether it's because like engineering for the ranked resets was ran into some problems, or our changes were ready a lot earlier or whatever, and we didn't feel like we wanted to hold them. Yeah, I think we just decided to just put them out like in June or whatever it was. But ideally, we would want to release them at the same time so that we reset the ranks and people have new content to play. So yeah,
makes sense.
I wanted to ask about, just out of curiosity, we last episode we talked a bit about game time. There was a big thing in MSI, a big topic. I wonder if this affects general play, SoloQ play, where Jinx was really prevalent and stuff, and people were just winning games off one team fight. Like you would just end the game. People just.
Yep.
Have you found game time lower at all in general? Or is that more?
Game time has been very stable for the last, I want to say, year actually.
Okay.
It's roughly around like 29 minutes. Like 28 to 30 minutes is generally the sweet spot for like the average game. At high elo, that's quite a bit faster. Like it can get down to like 25, 24 minutes on average. But then, for the average player, 28 to 30 minutes is about a good amount to have like a laning phase. Plates fall at 14. Then you have like some back and forth for when Baron spawns, and then you have like people are only realistically projecting threat in average games on Baron at like 22 to 23 minutes, so you have like I'm saying 9 minutes there, and then you have like 7 minutes after that, so like that feels like about reasonable. So I think we're pretty happy with that game time. At Elite, it's a little fast, I would say, for whatever reasons, whether it's like people are giving up and wanting to go next, or people are really good at snowballing leads, or a combination of both, or the champions that are played, like predominantly a lot more early game champions get played in Elite. And people are obviously not very good at closing out games in regular play. So combination of those, but I would say game time's in a pretty good spot overall, and snowballing's in a decent spot overall as well. I would say though, with the Jinx thing, I think it was like those two T1 games that they were playing where they just like aced them at the mid in a turret or whatever, and then they just ran in and ended. Like it's cool that to have champions that do that, right? Like, and I think that was a Jinx specific thing, because I think if you were to plug in Caitlyn or something, right, like they wouldn't end the game there. They would probably maybe get away with killing one Nexus turret, and then enemy team would spawn, they'd have to back off. And it's kind of cool for Jinx's thematic that she has a thing where it's like, oh, it's so explosive. Like the game is so explosive. Like, and there's ways you can play around it, right? It's like, don't go in 1v5 when you're the last person standing and you need to hold off the push against Jinx, right? Like that adds some interest to the game, like, so I think if it was happening with every champion, then yeah, that would be a problem. But I think because it was limited to just Jinx, like I believe the 2 blow through cases were only Jinx, I think it's all right. We did discuss some designs where we could prevent blow-throughs, because I think generally speaking, especially in pro games, when blow-throughs happen, it's pretty unsatisfying of an experience. Even though it's nice to, like blow-throughs allow for comebacks, like if you can think of it that way. Like let's say your team is really ahead and then you like giga throw and you get aced in the late game. Like having a blow through in that situation is really cool, right? Like you're down 10k gold and you're like, oh, if we just ace them in one team fight, like we can win the game, right? And that's a cool experience, right? Like that's something that's really memorable. So if we were to change anything about blow throughs, we would lose those as well, which is like, is that worth it? Like I don't think so on balance, but maybe it's worth it. I'm not sure.
Such a theme. This is like a theme throughout this entire episode and your entire job. It's literally like, okay, if we do that, what's going to happen on the other side? If we do this, what's going to happen there? It's literally the definition of just visualizing what would happen if.
Yeah. There's like 500 of these ifs, like like scales. Like, okay, well, if this happens, then this happens, and then if this happens, then this happens. If we change this about this item, then this is gonna happen. If we release this mechanic on this champion, then that's gonna happen. That's basically my job in a nutshell. Yeah, and that's only the balance part. That's not even including because right now we're deep in the what do you call it? We're deep in preseason development right now, so it's just like like 80% of my day is like preseason, like for the last like few months. So it's like balance is like it's important, but it's like getting preseason, testing all of these different things, because the thing that you guys end up with at preseason is going to be version 55 or something, right? Like we'll have like tested so many different things by the time we release whatever we have that is the actual challenging part of it. Like balancing it is a lot easier than actually designing it, in my opinion.
And I was gonna ask, I don't think we should ask about the stuff about Emerald tier, and because that's not really his forte.
Yeah, forte. I mean, I think I actually have a curiosity in terms of about has there been more change?
I mean, I can talk about it. It's just I
was just going to ask. Okay. I mean, I guess we can talk about it. Because we've talked about it on the podcast and the other episode about how it would, how it's going to. I mean,
what their forecast. So it's in like what the forecast is meant to be, right? And like, so a lot of the silver players are going to be all now gold, and sometimes maybe even like there's some like low plat or whatever, and then like all the gold players are going to be plat and whatever. So everyone's being pushed up in a way, right? Which I think, it's good, right? Because now it's going to be a lot more flat in a way with like the distribution of the player base throughout all the ranks. That makes more sense. We're thinking of it from the side of, okay, what is the average player experience in their journey? Because we all know ranked is an incredibly emotionally taxing thing. Like when you get a rank or when you get LP, you lose LP, we're not logical about it. It's like, it's not like we're going to be like, oh, this is what Ryan intended. And, I'm now this rank. It's like, no, we're going to be emotional about it. And then it's going to take some time to adjust. Like, I think like the way we're viewing it is that there's going to be some adjustment period. There's going to be some happy people, not happy people. And it is what it is. And I feel like a month's going to pass and everyone's going to be happy chappy. The first month's going to be chaos. People are going to lose their minds a little bit. Everyone's going to be like, oh my God, I'm in this rank. And there's going to be the ranked anxiety. I've never been plat in my life. And now I'm platinum. I'm in plat 2 now. Oh my God. What do I do? So, but they'll wear off. Time will, do its thing, really.
I mean, for the most part, people are going to go up. I think it makes your jobs kind of a little easier in the sense that people are more frequently going to be reaching these milestones. So it's not like like I have so much anxiety about getting gold, like there's like, oh, well, actually, like during the season, you're going to go through silver and then through gold and then through plat, probably, right? And so it's going to, having more frequent milestones just makes it easier for you guys as coaches, because in my opinion, at least, well, as a former coach as well, right? And it's like, if you have achievable goals, you can be like, okay, well, this is what a plat player does generally, and this is what a gold player does generally. And like previously you'd have to be like, well, this is what a gold 2 player does, right? Like this is just like it's just like some random arbitrary,
and it's
like,
so
thing,
different.
Right?
Like this,
it becomes easier to break point like what people are doing.
100%, because there's such a big difference between like a Platinum 1 player and a Platinum 4 player. Like it's ginormous, and it's currently staged like or a D2 and a D4, like these massive jumps.
Yeah. Well, the interesting gap that we talked about, we found is that we think Silver 1 players are actually pretty good at the game.
Yeah.
And the gap between Silver 1 and like Iron and Bronze is like gigantic. Like
So to be clear, like we've structured our program so we have like, well, it's like kind of like a below gold and above gold type thing, right? And coming in, we had no idea how to really conceptualize what does a silver 2 versus a bronze 3 really look like? And the conclusion that we've both come to, just in our own experiences, like, oh wow, a silver 2 player is quite good at the game. Like they're actually pretty good at the game. They're not what I would think is really even a beginner.
Yeah.
They're not even a beginner.
Like
a silver player is not a beginner.
They all know they know all the abilities, the abilities, champions, people like,
for the most part,
identities.
For the most part, but whereas like you can't even. It's even scary to recommend the same type of champion for a silver player versus like a bronze player, because it's just night and day difference in terms of like their competence over the game. So there's something we've realized, wow, there actually is a very, very steep jump between bronze 1, silver 2, things that we've kind of experienced as well. So that's been very interesting seeing that journey.
Yeah. Did you guys play in PC bongs when you were in Korea?
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I had this funny story because when I went to Korea last time and I was playing on one of the Riot accounts, right? And that was, challenging for me because it was like, in roughly master tier. I did fine. I was like 6 and 6 or something. But I was sitting next to some guy who was playing Riven, and he was just like doing the most insane Riven. So I was like, huh? And then like he loaded into the game and I saw the silver border. I was like, what on earth? Like that was absurd. Like I could not believe it. Like the mechanics that the guy was doing in silver were just like eye-poppingly like crazy. I was just like, this is absurd. Then when I was playing in the games, I was like, oh, okay, I see. Like, everyone's 4 people are ganking this Jax while they're obviously posturing around Baron. And so it's like we're in like Masters games where we're like all going to kill this Jax and the enemy team just takes Baron. I'm like, what are we doing? Like it just makes no sense. It's like
what's
all
interesting,
hands no rain. Like it's definitely the case.
Because you've been around for quite a long time. You've been, playing League for such a long time. We've all kind of seen kind of the evolution of what a lower elo player is, in a way where, when we played, not everyone had good kind of mechanics. Like you would think of like a gold player back, say season 2, season 3, they were real, like mechanically not even remotely competent with the game. Whereas nowadays, the average silver player...
Oh yeah, horrible.
Yeah. But nowadays, the average silver player can be mechanically competent. Mechanics aren't, and like overall champion, like their ability to control a character is not the key differentiating factor for the most part for the average player. Like in gold, everyone has pretty good mechanics for the most part. Like low gold, it's like crazy to me. Like that took ages for me to like really kind of reconcile, because for us that was not the case whatsoever. Like the average
season 2, 3,
season 2, 3, 4, like that gold player didn't have the knowledge and they didn't have the mechanics. Now the gold players, they have the mechanics, but they don't have the knowledge. And we had this discussion on last week's episode. We were saying like, what is League gonna look like? What is the average silver player gonna look like in 10 years? How high is that kind of barrier to entry going to be just as the game becomes more sophisticated? It's going to be very interesting with all, obviously educational content's getting better. There's more, coaching is becoming more accessible. Coaches are getting better now, nowadays. What is the average beginner's experience going to be like in League? Imagine if you hadn't touched a PC game. But then in saying that, right, like, the amount of people that haven't touched a PC game, until they're 21 is probably going to be less and less in the future as well, though, right? Like, given how integrated, computer gaming is,
and online, and people
online gaming, everyone's working from home. PC, like being on a PC is normal. Like, remember, like, I don't know about you, like in school when we were younger, like when we were in primary school, if you played computer games, like you played it was like, what the hell? Like, there was like two people in my entire year level that actually played a game on a PC. Yeah. Like, no one even owned a PC, let alone they just played consoles. But it's kind of gone the complete other way, hasn't it? Like, not many people play consoles. Everyone plays PC now. It's kind of interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, one thing that we often observe is that new players will try and use WASD to like move. Clicking to move is it's a very RTS, like StarCraft, Warcraft type of concept, right? It's
very intuitive.
And we still have that concept. It's very archaic, right? Like, it's not a modern day control scheme at all. So it's very interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. Talking about educating the player base, what's right? Like, Riot generally, we had another topic that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months about. Riot don't really do too much of a good job of like educating new players. Like, there's still stuff in the class. Obviously, the tutorial, we sort of talked about how the tutorial was like, did a really bad job.
Well, yeah, we don't think the quality of the tutorial is obviously is that amazing. Yeah.
Do you guys sort of just think it's just better to leave it to
for sure
YouTubers and like the general player base to like?
It's not that it's better to leave it. It's just like a. Well, so there's a few things, right? Like, one, direct instruction, like people giving direct instruction is oftentimes a lot more useful than tutorials. Like, generally speaking, like, people click through tutorials very often, right? Like, I click through tutorials when I play like Lost Ark or something, right? Like, I'm not sitting through the tutorial. I'm just like clicking through the tutorial and I'm doing my thing.
I want to get in and play.
Like, we know people don't do that, right? And for the most part, like, especially for League and things like that, like, usually if you're playing League, you're playing with a friend, and a friend is teaching you how to play the game. And ultimately, that's going to be very effective, like quite effective. I wouldn't say it's that we don't prioritize it. It's that we need to figure out a way to do something that's better than tutorials, right? Because tutorials are like expensive to make. They get outdated. They need to be localized. Like, it doesn't even really teach you the game like the way that, me or you guys would want to teach someone the game, right? Like, I would want to teach them about trading, but those things are just like such complicated concepts. It's like you need like a world-class tutorial builder to like actually teach those concepts, and that takes a lot of resources and things like that, right? And so it's like, if you were to ask me, and again, I'm not in charge of this thing, but it's like, would I rather have 20 developers working on a tutorial, or I would rather have 20 developers working on making more changes for the actual game and having friends teach their friends how to play the game, right? Like, I'd probably choose the latter one. Maybe I would siphon off like 5 or 10 people to maybe there are some points in the onboarding flow that are like people bounce off pretty regularly, like helping somebody find their main role or helping somebody find the first champion. Like, certainly we should invest in more in something like that. But, like building full-fledged tutorials, like those things, they're so expensive. They have like a lot of downsides to them, the development costs, they get outdated, etc. So, if you were to ask me, would I rather spend 20 people, working on this thing, or 20 people working on gameplay? I would probably rather have them work on gameplay. Right?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's true. Even for us with our coaching programs, we got to update stuff all the time. I mean, builds, champion, even champ identities change.
But that's the great thing about League, because it is updated consistently, and you guys are always making changes. It's fresh and it's fun and it's exciting, it's challenging, and that's one of the things we love about League the most. Like, you're forced to adapt. You can't just develop this one skill set that you've had for 10 years and then rest on your laurels and then that's it. You're always forced to adapt and get better and learn new things and figure shit out. And that's what makes League, that is fundamentally, in my opinion, the number one reason why League is as popular as it is, comparatively to what other games out there, like, and other game companies like Valve. Like, they're just terrible.
Slow to update things.
Updating their games, and League is so good at making it fresh.
Imagine if we were like right now still in like we'll just chip it. We're just getting into season 5 right now. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be scary to think about.
Yeah.
Well, the game wouldn't be half
like, guys, we've been playing in Rek'sai Farm Alarm Cinderhawk meta for like 3 years. Please change something. Yeah.
Yuumi just took forever. It took like 4
Yuumi's
years.
Still like it was on release.
Right. Yeah, that would be That would be difficult.
Has the Riot team
Yeah,
expanded?
it is nice to have the patch cycle.
Out of curiosity, like, is there? I feel like there's so many changes this year. Is that normal? Like, or is this just recency bias? Have you guys got more people, or is it the same amount of people?
We did get more people, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think, people have mentioned it in other places, but I think in general, like League's gotten a good amount of funding this year relative to previous years, and so we're using that in various ways. Our team in particular has been, like people have been having to do preseason and balance at the same time, pretty consistently for the last few years. So nowadays there's like Freak is more focused directly on balance rather than having to work on balance and preseason. I get to spend more of my time overseeing preseason directly as well as balance, like on the days that I need to think about balance. So in general, like we have a lot more firepower to be able to handle both of those things and spin up new work streams as well and loan people out. So for example, like the new arena mode, like we had the number of people that we were able to send a few designers over to help them build the mode, and then they would come back after. So we wouldn't have enough people to have done that in the past.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's
Do
nice.
you want to
It's a
start
lot more
wrapping this one
management
up?
overhead for me, but yeah, it's nice to have that amount of people.
Do you want to start wrapping it up soon, Nathan?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the jungle changes. Finish off with the jungle changes this year. This is going back again, like just curious about all the changes because I feel like this year was so many jungle changes, right? Like I got some written down here. We obviously had the 20% counter jungle debuff that came in, and then you guys reverted. Rift Herald 1.5 plates, 2.5 plates. The path in like Red Raptor's Gromp is now sort of an obsolete path. Now it's Red Krug's Raptor is very intuitive. I like that change. I think that's really good. Where are you guys at with jungle? Like, what's going on? Are you guys happy with? I guess the big preseason change initially I'll start with is the clearing. Are you guys happy with the more simplicity of the clear? You think it's a good balance of simplicity plus there's a level of skill to it still?
Yeah, I think I think it's better now that we reverted the counter jungling change. I think the counter jungling change was a bet that we were making that, at least when we had like player labs and things like that, it was testing pretty well with them. Like, oh, you're less likely to get counter juggled, and that because if you remember, the changes that we were doing were to get more people to play the jungle role. So like at the time, jungle for average play was by far the least picked role, and now it's in a very healthy spot. It's like the third most picked. So we succeeded on that avenue. It is slightly more powerful than it was before in some skill brackets. So I think in particular, I haven't been super happy with how powerful the early ganks are on top lane in particular. So we might make some like power redistributions to that. I think in 13, 14. But overall, I think it's been pretty good after we reverted the counter jungle changes because the counter jungle changes like limited so many options. Like it resulted directly in the gank bot meta because there was no counterplay. Like if the person ganked bot, you couldn't actually go counter jungle their top side because it was too hard to kill.
There was a very
So
common
now
situation.
the game tree is better.
There was a very common situation with the counter jungling changes. Like I had to change a whole different concept with specifically. There's a point in the game where the enemy's second spawn, like their second red buff or something spawns, and you have the option to do like the enemy jungle will gank bot. You have the option to either do Herald or take all their topside camps. And before it was, you always take like most of the time their topside camps because you just generate such a huge experience in goal and it's very quick. But through that change, I have to completely change that concept. It's like you actually have to take Herald. It's actually better to take Herald because it just takes too long to take those camps, especially for certain junglers.
Right.
Farming junglers were more able to do that. So like that had a huge impact on like this decision making in terms of jungle, and I really was not a fan of it at all.
Yeah, we did not. Yeah, we didn't like how it was playing out. So we just went back on that one, and I think that had a pretty drastic change in jungle popularity. Actually, surprisingly, it increased by something like 5 or 10% just on account of making that change.
Because then I guess people aren't getting counter jungled, and they're like, oh, that makes the role more fun or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it gives options back, right? Like you no longer felt like you just had to helplessly watch as your bot lane got murdered while you had no options like to do anything, right? Like, but I think, yeah, in general, I would say jungle's in a pretty good spot. I think the meta at the top level has been a little stale with Vi Wukong just being there all the time.
There's a lack of carry
you know, it's
junglers right
valuable.
now in competitive. Is that something you guys are looking at too much, or you're...
Yeah, I mean, we buffed Lee Sin last patch. We buffed Nidalee. We nerfed Vi and Wukong, so I think that will help
start
a
bumping up
little
the carry
bit.
junglers? Yeah.
We were considering buffing Viego, but actually Viego's like doing decently well.
I think Viego really
I mean,
loves
Kindred's
the Triforce.
Kindred's been really strong the last few patches,
yeah,
though,
Kindred,
I would say, as a carry jungler.
That's true.
So I think, yeah, overall we're pretty happy with it. I think just early gank lethality is something that I think we kind of made a bit of a philosophical change with junglers not having to purchase items early, basically, and that allowed them to buy, you know, double longsword in their first base, for example, and that increased their lethality in the early game by a lot. So I think we want to figure out a way to reduce that lethality somewhat. So we're going to nerf early red buff a little bit and see if there's any more places, and then give some power back in the more scaling portions of the role, because I think they're a little too influential in determining lane outcomes right now. Like, especially if you consider, you know, comparing it back to like season 2 to season 5 or something, like season 2 to season 6, like junglers early were kind of like bots, right? Like,
yeah.
They bought skirmishes. They were investing their first 1,000 gold into an item that gave no combat stats, right?
Gave us more
They
gold,
were
right?
way less lethal.
Heart of Gold.
Yeah, like you had to
Philosopher's
buy.
Stone.
No, you had to buy skirmish. Yeah, well, in season 2 you had to buy a Heart of Gold, but in season like 4, let's say, you had to buy Skirmisher's Saber.
Yeah.
Right.
Just helped you.
In
kill
season
ants.
3, you had to buy Spirit Stone. Right.
Where's
And I think that was
Lantern
generally
something
pretty
in there?
healthy for the role.
Wriggle's Lantern with the ward. Didn't it have a ward or something?
That was... But
Yeah, Wriggle's Lantern.
That got nerfed pretty quickly, though, I think. I think it was overtuned originally,
Yeah. But my point is that, like, in seasons past, junglers had to invest their first 1k gold into an item that gave no combat stats, and that basically reduced the lethality of early jungle ganks in the game by a significant amount. Whereas now, because you buy your jungle item with your first shop, and then you base, and then you buy 2 longswords, like, that's a massive swing in terms of, like...
Yeah, it's a good point. I didn't think about that. That's true. Yeah, we're way stronger early on.
First ganks are. Yeah, so I think that has room to come down a little bit. I don't know what we need to do to make that true. But I would say reducing that by like 10 to 15%, and then putting that power back into late game scaling, or like the gold that you get from like farming the jungle monsters or something like that, seems reasonable. Like, it would make everyone a little more happy. I think laners would be happier and junglers would be happier, because the benefit for farming camps would increase a little. So we need to figure out how to do that. I'm not exactly sure of the best way to do it right now, but it's something that we're looking at.
All right, well, sort of lastly, Phroxzon, can you give us any teasers on the preseason? Is it going to be a big one or a small one?
I will say that it's not going to be a small one.
Interesting.
But I won't say whether it's going to be a big one or a moderate-sized one. But it won't be a small one, yeah.
Okay. Would you say that the last one was a small one?
I would say last one's a small one, yeah.
Right. That's good as a reference.
It was just
point.
like localized to jungle role, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, we did jungle changes, and we did tank item changes. Those were the main things, I think. We did some mage item changes that...
There was a few mage items, right?
Only got shipped in 13.1.
Was it Roa?
We reverted Archangels.
Archangels?
And we added Roa. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on.
I think that preseason was pretty good, but yeah.
And thanks for taking the time again. It's our yearly check-in.
Yep.
See what Riot's up to. Get the philosophy, get the thought process.
Yep. And well, I mean, hopefully, maybe do a check-in at the end of the year or something.
I think this time of year is good because Yeah, I
anytime.
think preseason's like sort of
Like
a bit of a
talking to
shit
you
show. You know what I mean? And it's sort of like get into the middle. It's like what's the reflection of the preseason? How are we going? And what's the next couple of months going to maybe look like? You know, so I think that this time of the year is actually the sort of the perfect time to do the check in and sort of see how everything's gone. Are you happy with the preseason and stuff like that? You know what I mean?
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a tumultuous year, right? Like we had Zeri, Yuumi, we had, big mid-season changes. We had, like preseason jungle changes and all of the role balance stuff. It's been a pretty interesting
Like
year.
so much has happened. So much has happened in a short period of time. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Like it
Do you
goes
guys like
so
that
fast.
or not really?
It goes so fast. It's just a blur. It's like, and then it was like, the mage item changes, and then the jungle changes, and then there's Cassandra, and then Zeri Yuumi, and then Asol gets added in, and then the Neeko. It's just like a blur. There's just so much stuff that's happened. But it's good. Makes it exciting.
I like it. I think the game's definitely, I'm very, very happy with the game direction, I think.
And everyone in my program, by the way, they all think that the game is really, feels really good, feels really balanced, and they're really happy with the way the game is feeling overall. So feels really diverse and really good.
Keep it up, Phroxzon.
I'm hoping to kind of communicate more with the community in the next few months. I think at least see how that goes.
What will that look like? Is that more like YouTube content on the league main channels, or obviously you're big on Twitter.
Reddit or
I don't know, a bunch of Reddit stuff, Twitter things. I do the patch preview stuff. I was thinking of doing kind of weekly Q&As and things like that.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Nice.
Going more podcasts and stuff with
Sweet.
you guys or with other people that are not gonna just shit on us, basically. And I think it's nice with you guys because you guys obviously are pretty into the game, right? So we can talk pretty in depth about certain things, right? It's not going to be I don't know, I went to talk to some person that barely plays the game, right? I can talk about, hey, it's what it was in season 4, and you guys would know what I'm talking about, right?
Great.
All right, any last words, Phroxzon?
Awesome.
Any shout outs or anything like that?
Nope.
All right.
Beautiful.
Good luck to all your students on the climbs, I guess.
Awesome.
Since you guys are packing it up, I'm doing my last push as well.
Yep,
So.
10 days
Good luck.
left, I
Yeah,
think.
that goes.
The recording got 10 days left. So
The last bit of grind in.
yeah, well, our message to our students is,
Yeah,
the
10
work's
days.
done. We're not studying for a test. You know what I mean?
Hey, it's not for him. This is it.
All right.
This is his
The
grind
last
time.
rush, the cram time.
Cram time. All right.
Yeah. All right. Catch you guys later.
Catch you
All right,
later,
thanks for coming
Phroxzon.
again,
Have a
Phroxzon.
good one.